Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the golden death masks and towering monuments to discover what it really meant to be a pharaoh of ancient Egypt. You stand in the pre-dawn darkness of a palace bedroom, watching as a man, just a man really, opens his eyes and remembers he is supposed to be a god. The weight of that realization settles over him before his feet even touch the floor. Outside, thousands of subjects believe his words can make the Nile flood or the sun rise. Inside, he worries about the same things you do. His aching back, his difficult children, whether people truly respect him or just fear the crown. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why so many pharaohs married their own sisters, or what they actually did all day besides pose for statues. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're in bed in Buenos Aires or on a night shift in Tokyo. Maybe share what fascinates you most about ancient Egypt, or simply say hello. Your words create this community we're building together, one sleepy story at a time. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in the Nile Delta around 3100 BCE, and something revolutionary is happening. A king named Nama, or perhaps Menes, historians still argue whether they're the same person, is uniting two separate kingdoms into one impossible dream. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt have fought for generations, and now one man claims dominion over both. But claiming isn't enough. He needs something more powerful than armies, more lasting than treaties. He needs to become divine. You watch as the concept of the pharaoh crystallizes like salt from seawater. It's not enough to be a strong warrior or a clever administrator. The role demands transformation into something between human and god, a living hinge connecting the mortal realm to the cosmic order the Egyptians call Ma'at. You see priests developing rituals, testing incantations, crafting the elaborate theatre that will convince an entire civilization that their king literally descended from the sun god Ra himself. The process is more carefully constructed than you might imagine. Every gesture, every word, every piece of regalia carries symbolic weight. The double crown, the Shent, physically represents the union of two lands, red for Lower Egypt, white for Upper Egypt, nested together like a geometric puzzle. When the pharaoh places it on his head, he's not just wearing a hat. He's embodying a political statement, a religious truth, and a cosmic principle all at once. It's exhausting just thinking about it. You notice something peculiar about these early god kings. They're terrified of being ordinary. The entire apparatus of pharaonic power is built on maintaining absolute distinction from common people. Pharaohs develop a special royal "we" in their pronouncements. They commission artists to depict them as larger than everyone else in every carving and painting, not because ancient Egyptians couldn't grasp perspective, but because size equals importance in their visual language. The pharaoh must be bigger, more perfect, more eternal than anyone else, or the whole system collapses. But here's the quirky reality that rarely makes it into documentaries. These divine kings still burp, still stub their toes, still wake up with morning breath. The palace staff knows this intimately. Servants who dress the pharaoh, who empty his chamber pot, who trim his toenails, they're bound by sacred oaths never to reveal what they witness. Some historians believe certain servants were ritually blinded or had their tongues removed to protect royal secrets, though evidence for this remains debated. The god cannot be seen sweating or scratching himself or picking food from his teeth. You follow the early dynasties as they experiment with different aspects of divinity. Some pharaohs emphasize their role as Horus, the falcon god, protector and avenger. Others lean into their identity as sons of Re, bringing light and order to the world. Still others, and this gets interesting, claim to be the living embodiment of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. Imagine telling your subjects you're simultaneously alive and the god of the dead. The theological gymnastics alone could give you a headache. The said festival develops as a solution to a delicate problem. What happens when your god king gets old? You can't exactly retire a deity. Instead, pharaohs who survive 30 years of rule undergo this elaborate renewal ceremony, essentially rebooting their divinity. You watch as an aging king runs around markers in a ritual race, proving he still has the vigour to rule. It's like a divine performance review, except failing means cosmic chaos rather than just a bad quarterly evaluation. Religious texts begin describing the pharaoh's daily journey as mirroring Ra's path across the sky. When the king rises at dawn, he's not just waking up, he's being reborn with the sun. His evening rest mirrors Ra's nightly journey through the underworld. Every mundane action gets elevated to cosmic significance. Going to bed becomes a mythological event. You can imagine how exhausting it must be to live in constant symbolism, where scratching your nose might accidentally signal divine judgment or agricultural policy. Here's something that surprises modern minds. Egyptians didn't necessarily believe their pharaoh was literally, physically a god in the way we might think. It's more nuanced. The divine essence, the Ka, inhabited the royal body during the king's lifetime. The pharaoh was simultaneously a mortal man named Khufu or Amenhotep, and the earthly vessel for divine power. Think of it less like Superman is Clark Kent, and more like the presidency is embodied by whoever currently holds the office. The office is eternal, the man is temporary. You stand in the throne room as a young prince becomes pharaoh for the first time. The coronation lasts for days, each ritual building on the last. Priests purify him with water from the Nile and incense made from rare resins. They dress him in pleated linen so fine you can see through it, because gods don't need to hide their perfection. They place the false beard on his chin, that strange braided attachment that even female pharaohs will later wear, because the beard signifies divine kingship rather than masculinity. They hand him the crook and flail, shepherd's tools transformed into symbols of guidance and authority. You slip through a hidden doorway in the palace at Thebes, leaving behind the grand audience halls where the pharaoh sits frozen in divine perfection. Back here, in the private quarters, something remarkable happens. The god becomes a man again. The air smells different in these rooms. Less incense, more cooking oil and linen and human sweat. You watch as Ramesses II removes his elaborate wig, revealing his own thinning hair beneath. He scratches vigorously at his scalp, groaning with relief. For the past 6 hours he's been a living statue. Now finally he can move like a normal person. The royal apartments sprawl across multiple buildings, each serving specific functions. You wander through the sleeping chamber, where the pharaoh's bed sits low to the ground on a wooden frame, its mattress stuffed with straw and covered in linen sheets. It's not as luxurious as you might imagine. Egyptian beds include a curved headrest instead of a pillow, a wooden or stone cradle for the neck that looks wildly uncomfortable, but supposedly keeps elaborate hairstyles intact and prevents bugs from crawling in your ears while you sleep. Though let's be honest, no amount of divine status makes a stone pillow feel good at 3 in the morning. you notice servants preparing the evening meal in the private dining area. Here's something that shatters the mystique. Pharaohs loved food, sometimes to excess. Royal menus included bread, beer, roasted duck, beef, fish from the Nile, figs, dates, pomegranates, and honey-drenched pastries. Archaeologists examining royal mummies have found evidence of obesity, diabetes, and tooth decay from all that refined flour and honey. Being a god apparently didn't prevent cavities. Tutankhamun's mummy showed evidence of a painful dental abscess. Even teenage god kings suffered from toothaches and probably whined about them just like anyone else. The bathroom facilities reveal another humanizing detail. Yes, pharaohs used toilets, limestone seats with a hole positioned over a sand-filled container. Servants removed and replaced the sand regularly. Some palaces had multiple bathrooms, and the royal family bathed frequently, often several times daily in the scorching Egyptian heat. You watch servants pour water over the pharaoh's shoulders from decorative vessels, the water mixing with natron salt as a primitive soap. He's completely naked, completely human, his divine authority literally washing down the drain with the bath water. Historians still argue whether pharaohs maintained separate quarters from their wives or shared sleeping spaces. Evidence suggests arrangements varied by period and personal preference. Some queens had their own elaborate apartments within the palace complex. Others lived in a separate harem palace, though harem doesn't quite mean what Hollywood suggests. It was more administrative centre than pleasure palace, housing wives, children, their servants, tutors, and the massive bureaucracy required to manage royal family affairs. You peek into what might be called the Pharaohs study, though that's too modern a term. Here he reviews documents with his vizier, studying tax records written on papyrus, dispute settlements, reports from provincial governors. The work is tedious. Being a god king involves staggering amounts of paperwork. You watch his eyes glaze over as a scribe drones about grain allocations in the 15th nome. Divine or not, bureaucracy is still boring. Sometimes he waves his hand dismissively, trusting his administrators to handle details. Other times he focuses intensely, understanding that food distribution literally means life or death for his people. The royal wardrobe occupies an entire room, though it's less extensive than you might expect. Pharaohs owned multiple crowns, ceremonial kilts, and elaborate collars made from gold and semi-precious stones. But daily wear was surprisingly simple. Pleated linen kilts, sometimes a loose linen shirt, and sandals made from papyrus or leather. In private, pharaohs often went barefoot. The elaborate costumes you see in reliefs were for public appearances only, putting on divinity like other people put on work clothes. Here's a quirky detail that makes these figures more relatable. Pharaohs had pets, not just sacred animals for religious purposes, but actual beloved companions. Cats, obviously, prowled the palace hunting mice. Some pharaohs kept dogs, hunting hounds and smaller companion breeds. Others maintained private menageries with gazelles, monkeys, even lions. Ramesses, too, reportedly had a tame lion that accompanied him into battle, because apparently being pharaoh meant you could have an emotional support lion. Imagine the palace servants tasked with feeding that thing. You observe the pharaoh's evening routine. He removes his jewellery piece by piece, heavy gold that's left marks on his shoulders and neck. Servants massage scented oils into his skin. Moringa oil, castor oil, almond oil infused with myrrh. It's not just luxury. The desert climate wreaks havoc on skin. Even gods need moisturizer. His body bears the marks of his mortality. Scars from childhood accidents, maybe a war wound, the early stages of arthritis that will plague his later years. Under the makeup and regalia, He's just a middle-aged man with creaky joints. The private quarters also housed what we might call the Pharaohs' hobbies. Some played Senet, that ancient Egyptian board game found in so many tombs, suggesting they enjoyed it enough to want it in the afterlife. Others practiced music, harps, lutes, and drums. Akhenaten apparently wrote poetry, though his hymn to the Aten might have been more religious obligation than leisure activity. These moments of recreation were rare, stolen hours when the performance of godhood could pause. Children complicate the private space. Royal offspring, legitimate and otherwise, periodically invade these quarters. You watch a young prince race through, pursued by exasperated tutors, and see the pharaoh's face soften into something approaching normal paternal affection. He scoops up the boy, tickles him until he shrieks with laughter, then grows serious, remembering himself. Even affection must be measured, controlled. The child who today receives playful roughhousing might tomorrow be competing for the throne. Every interaction carries dynastical weight. Sleep rarely comes easily for pharaohs. You watch this one lie awake, staring at ceiling paintings of protective goddesses, mind churning through the day's decisions. Did he judge that property dispute fairly? Will the harvest support the pyramid construction? Is the high priest of Amun becoming too powerful? Should he have executed that conspirator or shown mercy? Gods aren't supposed to doubt themselves, but this man does, endlessly, in the private darkness where no subjects can see his uncertainty. The palace at night fills with sounds, distant music from the guards' quarters, the rustle of servants on errands, night birds calling from the gardens, the eternal whisper of the Nile somewhere beyond the walls. In these hours, stripped of crown and ceremony, the pharaoh is just another person struggling with insomnia, worrying about his family, feeling the burden of choices made and choices looming. The secret is that the palace, for all its grandeur, is still just a house, and the god sleeping fitfully within its walls is still fundamentally, undeniably, beautifully human. You stand in the shadowed corridors connecting the royal apartments to the women's quarters, where power takes a different form entirely. Here, queens and secondary wives navigate a world of whispered influence and strategic patience. The great royal wife, the pharaoh's principal queen, occupies apartments nearly as lavish as his own, her chambers decorated with painted lotus columns and furniture inlaid with ivory and ebony. But you quickly realize her true power doesn't come from decor. It flows through conversations, through the sons she bears, through the web of family alliances she maintains like a spider tending her silk. You watch Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III, as she meets privately with foreign ambassadors. She's conducting diplomacy while her husband naps away a heavy lunch. Letters found at Amarna confirm that foreign kings wrote directly to Egyptian queens, recognizing them as political forces in their own right. Tiye corresponded with Mitanni rulers, Hittite kings, and Babylonian princes. She wasn't just decorative royalty, she was effectively co-regent, managing international relations while maintaining the public fiction that all authority flowed from her divine husband. The pharaoh made pronouncements, the queen made things actually happen. The institution of the great royal wife carries immense significance. She's not simply the king's favourite, she's the mother of the next pharaoh, the human vessel who produces divinity. This gives her a bargaining position no amount of male authority can completely override. You see it in how servants address her, the reverence in their voices. She bears titles like Lady of the Two Lands and God's Wife, designations that elevate her nearly to her husband's level. Some queens even appear in temple reliefs the same size as the pharaoh, breaking that cardinal rule about royal proportions. That's how much influence they wielded. Here's where things get complicated and a bit weird by modern standards. Pharaohs frequently married their sisters. Amosai married his sister Amos Nefertari. Thutmose married his half-sister Hatshepsut. Ramesses II married at least 2 of his daughters. Historians still argue whether these marriages were fully consummated or primarily symbolic, maintaining bloodline purity in a culture obsessed with divine lineage. The logic went something like this. If pharaohs are gods, who else is worthy to marry them except other children of gods? Regular humans wouldn't do, so the gene pool stayed very, very small, which explains some of the health issues you'll encounter later. You follow a secondary wife through her daily routine. She's not the great royal wife. Maybe she's a diplomatic marriage, a Hittite princess sent to seal a treaty, or perhaps the daughter of a powerful Egyptian noble. Her apartments are comfortable but noticeably less grand. She spends hours on grooming, knowing her beauty and charm are her only real assets. Servants apply kohl around her eyes, the thick black lines serving both cosmetic and practical purposes. The lead-based makeup actually helped reduce glare from the brutal sun and prevented eye infections. She drapes herself in pleated linen so fine it's nearly transparent, fastens an elaborate collar of turquoise and carnelian around her neck, and prepares to casually encounter the pharaoh in the palace gardens. The competition among royal wives could turn vicious. You sense the tension when they gather for religious festivals, each woman calculating her position in the hierarchy. Who sits closest to the pharaoh? Whose son gets mentioned in official inscriptions? Who receives the largest estate and most productive lands? These aren't petty concerns. They determine survival. A queen who produces no sons or whose sons die young can find her status evaporating like morning dew. Her apartments get reassigned. Her servants get transferred. She becomes invisible, a forgotten footnote. Some royal women refused invisibility. Hatshepsut remains the most famous example, a queen who declared herself pharaoh and ruled for over 2 decades. You watch her in her early years as queen regent, ostensibly ruling for her young stepson Thutmose III, but gradually assuming more and more authority. She starts appearing in male pharaonic regalia, including that ceremonial false beard. She commissions texts calling her His Majesty. She even retroactively declares that a moon impregnated her mother in divine form, giving herself the same divine birth mythology as male pharaohs. It's audacious, brilliant, and it actually worked for a generation. The harem, that misunderstood institution, functions more like a small city than a pleasure palace. Located in places like the Fayum or at Medinet Habu, these complexes housed hundreds of people, royal wives, their children, servants, administrators, guards, weavers, musicians, and tutors. They produced luxury textiles, trained royal children, and managed vast agricultural estates. You wander through workshops where women spin flax into thread, weave thread into linen, and embroider linen with elaborate patterns. The harem palace is basically a royal factory disguised as domestic space. But let's not romanticize it too much. These women, however powerful, remain essentially captive. A royal wife cannot divorce, cannot leave, cannot choose another partner. Her entire existence orbits one man and his favour. When that man dies, her fate depends entirely on the next pharaoh's whims. Will he honour his father's wives, support them, ignore them? The uncertainty must be terrifying. Some royal widows retained influence by becoming kings' mothers or great royal aunts. Others vanished from history entirely, their names erased, their tombs unfinished. You discover evidence of a darker reality. the harem conspiracy under Rameses III. In the palace at Thebes, one of the secondary wives, Tie, organised an assassination plot to kill the pharaoh and install her son on the throne. She recruited other discontented wives, palace officials, and even military officers. They used magic, wax figures and spells, alongside more practical methods like poison. The plot was discovered, and the papyrus records of the trial survive. Dozens were executed. Tia's son was forced to commit suicide. The woman who dreamed of making her child pharaoh instead destroyed him completely. Yet some queens achieved something approaching genuine partnership with their pharaohs. You see it in Nefertiti's prominence in Akhenaten's reign, appearing in royal art more than any queen before her, sometimes even depicted smiting enemies, a role traditionally reserved for pharaohs alone. You sense it in the love poetry inscribed for Nefertari by Rameses II, who built her a temple at Abu Simbel standing alongside his own. "The sun shines for your beauty," the inscription reads. Whether genuine affection or masterful propaganda, the sentiment feels almost touchingly human. The royal children raised in these quarters face their own peculiar pressures. Daughters might be married to their fathers, brothers, or foreign princes as diplomatic tools. Sons compete against half-brothers for inheritance, knowing only one can become pharaoh, and the losers risk elimination. You watch young princes trained in warfare, administration, and religion, while young princesses learn music, dance, and the subtle arts of influence. Every child understands from birth that they're not quite human, not quite divine, but something precarious in between, valuable only as long as they serve dynastic purposes. As night falls over the women's quarters, you hear singing from one apartment, quiet weeping from another. A queen prays to Hathor for fertility. A forgotten wife plots revenge. A young princess practices her harp, dreaming of a marriage that might bring her importance. And somewhere in these scented, gilded rooms, the next pharaoh grows in a royal womb, already accumulating the expectations and burdens that will define his entire existence. The secret is that these women, queens, wives, concubines, daughters, shaped Egypt as surely as any pharaoh, but from shadows instead of thrones, with whispers instead of pronouncements, with patience instead of power. You stand beside the pharaoh at dawn as servants place the double crown upon his head, and you feel the symbolic weight settle onto his shoulders like physical stone. The Shent, that nested combination of red and white, represents an impossible burden. He rules not one kingdom but two, Upper and Lower Egypt, territories that spent centuries warring before unification. Every decision must balance competing interests, rival priesthoods, regional pride, and ancient grudges. One crown would be heavy enough, two might crush an ordinary man. The morning begins with obligations that never end. You follow him to the window of appearances, where he must present himself to gathered courtiers and common people. They need to see him, to confirm his continued existence and divine vitality. He cannot look tired, cannot show weakness, cannot display the headache currently pounding behind his eyes. He smiles, that formal, distant smile, and accepts petitions. A farmer begs for tax relief after poor floods. A merchant disputes import duties. A priest requests funds for temple repairs. Each problem requires Solomon-like wisdom, instant and infallible. Gods don't say, "Let me think about it," or "I'll get back to you." They pronounce judgment and their word becomes reality. You sense the constant calculation behind his eyes. Approve the tax relief and he sets precedent. Soon every farmer will claim hardship. Deny it, and he risks appearing unmerciful. which contradicts Ma'at's principle of justice. He splits the difference, reducing but not eliminating the tax, and watches the farmer bow gratefully while probably still worrying about making ends meet. No one is truly satisfied, which means the pharaoh has governed correctly. Perfect solutions don't exist, only balanced compromises that prevent outright rebellion. The administrative burden would stagger modern presidents. Egypt stretches nearly 700 miles from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract, encompassing deserts, farmland, quarries, and trading posts. The pharaoh theoretically owns everything, every grain of wheat, every cow, every brick. Obviously he can't micromanage a civilization, so he delegates to the vizier and nomarchs, regional governors who hold dangerous amounts of local power. You watch him read reports from the vizier detailing grain storage levels, copper mining output, and temple construction progress. He must remember it all, correlate it, make decisions that ripple across generations. Here's something that never appears on temple walls. Pharaohs regularly failed at this impossible job. Some delegated too much and lost control to powerful priests or nobles. Others micromanaged obsessively and drowned in details while missing larger threats. A few simply gave up, retreating into pleasure and letting the bureaucracy run itself into the ground. The system persisted despite individual pharaohs, not because of them, held together by talented administrators who did the real work while their god-king posed for statues. Military leadership adds another crushing layer. Pharaohs are expected to be warrior kings, personally leading armies against Nubians, Libyans, Hittites, and whoever else threatens Egypt's borders. You stand beside a young pharaoh reviewing his troops, watching him hide his terror behind divine arrogance. He's never actually fought in battle. He's 19 years old and spent his life in palaces, but tomorrow he'll ride his chariot at the front of the army because that's what pharaohs do. If he shows fear, the entire army loses confidence. If he stays safely behind, he's mocked as weak. So he'll ride into literal arrow range, trusting his bodyguards and probably praying to every god he supposedly embodies. Some pharaohs genuinely excelled at warfare. Thutmose III led 17 military campaigns, expanding Egypt to its greatest extent. Rameses II fought the Hittites at Kadesh in one of history's largest chariot battles, though historians still argue whether he won, lost, or achieved bloody stalemate. The pharaoh himself claimed glorious solo victory, personally slaughtering thousands while his cowardly army fled. The Hittite records tell a different story. Propaganda served both empires, and truth drowned somewhere in the Orontes River along with the bodies. But here's the thing about maintaining divine perfection. You can never admit mistakes, never acknowledge defeat, never show weakness. You watch the pharaoh navigate a political disaster, perhaps a failed campaign, a poor harvest, a collapsed building project. He cannot say "I was wrong" or "we miscalculated." Instead, priests and scribes craft narratives where setbacks become temporary tests, defeats transform into moral victories, and failures disappear from official record entirely. The pharaoh literally rewrites reality through sheer insistence, and the population largely accepts it because the alternative, a fallible god-king, threatens cosmic order itself. Religious duties consume enormous time and energy. As high priest of every temple, the pharaoh theoretically performs daily rituals for every deity in the pantheon. Obviously impossible, so he has proxies, but he must still attend major festivals, make public offerings, and consecrate new temples. You follow him into the inner sanctuary at Karnak, that holy of holies where only he can enter. He approaches the cult statue of a moon, hidden behind sealed doors. He breaks the seal, opens the doors, and addresses the god image as an equal. He feeds it, clothes it, applies sacred oils. He's serving the god while simultaneously being a god, and somehow this paradox makes sense to everyone involved. The weight of succession haunts every pharaoh without a clear heir. He needs sons, multiple sons, because infant mortality and assassination ensure not all will survive. But each son represents future threat. Will they grow impatient, waiting for power, plot against him? The pharaoh watches his oldest son with mingled pride and suspicion, wondering if the boy prays for his father's death. Some pharaohs appointed co-regents, having their intended heir rule alongside them to ensure smooth transition. Others kept potential successors under close watch, half imprisoned in the palace. You notice how the burden ages him prematurely. Stress lines etch his face deeper each year. His hair greys, or would if he didn't shave it and wear wigs. His shoulders slump when he thinks no one's watching. Being pharaoh means permanent performance anxiety, knowing that any mistake, any sign of weakness, any human failing could unravel the entire civilization. The Nile floods because the pharaoh maintains Ma'at. Crops grow because his divinity ensures fertility. Order persists because he stands between Egypt and chaos. At least that's the story everyone tells. The responsibility for natural disasters, famines, plagues, all of it lands on his supposedly divine shoulders. Some cracked under the pressure. Akhenaten abandoned traditional religion entirely, moving the capital to Amarna and worshipping only the sun disk Aten. Was it spiritual revelation or mental breakdown? Historians still argue. The experiment lasted barely 2 decades before his successors methodically erased his name from monuments and tried to pretend his reign never happened. The double crown cannot tolerate revolutionary thinking, only careful, conservative maintenance of ancient traditions. Night brings no relief from responsibility. You watch the pharaoh in his private chambers, still wearing an abbreviated crown because even in sleep he must remain partially divine. Servants stand ready through the night in case he needs anything. He can never truly be alone, never completely off duty. The role of pharaoh doesn't clock out. It consumes every hour from coronation to death, grinding away at the human being underneath until only the divine mask remains. And the terrible secret, the one that keeps him awake as Thebes slumbers around him, is that he's not sure the divine part is real. He's just a man doing his best to wear the double crown, without being crushed by its weight, maintaining the performance because if he stops, if he admits his mortality, then the whole magnificent lie collapses into dust. You enter the royal physician's chambers to find the pharaoh stripped of his divine regalia, lying on a simple bed while doctors examine a swollen, painful foot. The smell of herbal poultices fills the air, frankincense, myrrh, honey mixed with ground willow bark. For all his godhood, his body betrays him constantly. Gout, arthritis, infected wounds, dental abscesses, parasitic infections from the Nile. Pharaohs suffered from the same ailments as their subjects, sometimes worse because their rich diets and sedentary ceremonial lives invited metabolic diseases. Modern examination of royal mummies reveals a catalogue of suffering that shatters any illusion of divine invulnerability. Tutankhamun walked with a cane, his foot clubbed from birth, his spine curved with scoliosis. Ramesses II lived into his 90s, but spent his final decades bent with arthritis, his teeth ground to nubs, abscesses riddling his jaw. Amenhotep III became so obese in later life that he could barely walk. his mummy showing evidence of painful tooth decay and probable diabetes. Even Hatshepsut, that formidable female pharaoh, suffered from what appears to have been skin disease and possibly cancer, dying in her 50s after years of declining health. The royal physicians occupied an impossible position, tasked with healing someone who theoretically couldn't get sick. You watch them work with a combination of genuine medical knowledge and desperate hope. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced in some ways. They understood that the heart pumped blood. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and perform basic surgery. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes 48 surgical cases with rational observational approaches, but they also believed disease stemmed from supernatural causes, angry gods, malevolent spirits, or imbalances in bodily fluids that don't actually exist. Treatment protocols mix the practical with the bizarre. For that infected foot, the physician applies honey, which actually has antibacterial properties, but also recites spells to drive out demons. He prescribes medicine containing ground beetle shells, crocodile dung and mouse tails, mixed into beer or wine to make it barely drinkable. Some remedies worked despite the weird ingredients. Others were pure placebo. You watch the pharaoh swallow the concoction without complaint, because showing disgust would be undignified. Gods don't grimace at nasty medicine. Here's a quirky detail that makes ancient Egypt more relatable. Pharaohs got constipated, and their doctors obsessed about it. Egyptian physicians believed good health depended on regular bowel movements, so they prescribed endless laxatives and enemas. The Ebers Papyrus lists dozens of purgative recipes. Imagine being a divine ruler and having your day interrupted by urgent intestinal distress caused by overzealous medical intervention. The glamour of absolute power dims considerably when you're racing to the royal toilet. Dental problems plagued nearly every pharaoh. Egyptian bread contained sand and grit from the grinding stones, which wore teeth down to the pulp over years of eating. Resulting infections caused excruciating pain and sometimes death. Archaeologists examining skulls have found abscesses so severe they eroded jawbone. One pharaoh, identity debated, appears to have died from a tooth infection that spread to his brain. All the divine authority in Egypt couldn't save him from bacteria. His physicians tried drilling into the abscess, a procedure that probably killed him faster while causing unimaginable agony. You discover evidence of malaria in several royal mummies, DNA extracted from Tutankhamun confirming multiple bouts of the disease. Mosquitoes don't care about bloodline purity or divine status. They bite pharaohs as readily as peasants. The resulting fevers, chills, and weakness must have been terrifying for young kings raised to believe their health reflected cosmic order. What does it mean when the living embodiment of Ra shivers with fever and vomits into a golden bowl? Genetic disorders haunted the royal family due to generations of incestuous marriage. Akhenaten's elongated skull and strange body proportions, exaggerated in art but possibly based on real deformity, might have resulted from Marfan syndrome or another genetic condition. His daughters showed similar features. Tutankhamun's clubfoot, curved spine, and probable hormonal disorders likely stemmed from his parents being siblings. The same inbreeding that supposedly preserved divine purity actually corrupted the gene pool, creating fragile pharaohs who barely survived childhood. Mental illness remains harder to diagnose across millennia, but hints appear in historical records. Akhenaten's radical religious upheaval and obsessive focus on the Aten suggests possible fanaticism or psychotic episode. Some scholars interpret his behaviour as schizophrenia, though that remains speculative. Other pharaohs displayed erratic judgment, paranoid purges of advisors, and grandiose delusions that exceeded even normal pharaonic ego. Historians still argue whether this represents mental illness, personality disorders, or simply the corrupting influence of absolute power on human psychology. Women's health issues rarely appear in official records, but royal women face particular dangers. Childbirth killed in ancient Egypt just as it did everywhere before modern medicine. Queens were expected to produce heirs, subjecting themselves repeatedly to pregnancy's risks. Some died in childbirth. Others survived multiple births only to suffer from prolapsed uterus, fistulas, and chronic infections. Cleopatra VII, centuries later, reportedly used primitive birth control methods including crocodile dung pessaries, which probably didn't work but at least showed awareness that constant pregnancy damaged health. The pharaoh's physicians tried everything to heal their divine patient, including dream interpretation. If medicine failed, they consulted dream books, believing gods sent healing instructions through dreams. You watch as the pharaoh describes a dream involving a white bull and sailing upstream. The dream interpreter, part priest, part doctor, consults scrolls and declares this means the pharaoh should visit the temple of Apis at Memphis and make offerings. It's not medical advice, but it might provide psychological comfort, which has value when dealing with chronic illness. Some conditions had no treatment, only management. You see an aging pharaoh dealing with what's probably prostate issues, making frequent painful trips to urinate, his physicians helpless beyond prescribing more of those useless purgatives. He endures this indignity while maintaining public appearances, standing for hours in ceremony while desperately needing relief. The performance never stops, even when his bladder screams for mercy. Addiction occasionally appears in the historical record. Some pharaohs used opium for pain management and apparently couldn't stop. Others relied too heavily on beer, the Egyptian staple drink, progressing from normal consumption to problematic dependence. Imagine a hungover god trying to perform dawn rituals with a splitting headache and churning stomach. The priests around him pretend not to notice, maintaining the fiction of divine perfection while their king quietly suffers very human consequences. The cruelest irony is that pharaohs received the best medical care available in ancient Egypt, and it still wasn't enough. The finest physicians, the rarest ingredients, the most powerful spells, none of it could prevent aging, disease, and death. You watch an elderly pharaoh examine his reflection in polished bronze, seeing wrinkles, age spots, and the unmistakable evidence of mortality. He's spent decades being worshipped as immortal, and now his own body betrays the lie. Soon he'll die like any commoner, and all his divinity won't prevent the slow decay waiting in the tomb. The secret is that gods bleed, gods hurt, gods die. They just have to pretend otherwise until the very end, maintaining the sacred fiction that becomes harder to believe with every aching joint and laboured breath. You wake before dawn with the pharaoh. Though wake isn't quite accurate, he's been lying awake for hours, dreading the day ahead. The role of pharaoh doesn't allow for sleeping in or taking personal days. Every sunrise demands his participation in the cosmic drama of creation. Servants enter his chambers carrying ritual items before the first light touches the palace walls. The performance of divinity begins before his eyes fully open. The purification comes first. You follow him to a private courtyard where priests wait beside a limestone basin filled with water drawn from the Nile during the previous day's sacred hour. The water is cold, shockingly so in the pre-dawn chill, but he must immerse himself completely. This isn't bathing for cleanliness. This is symbolic rebirth. washing away the night's death-like sleep and emerging renewed with the sun. Priests recite incantations as water streams off his body. He's shivering, but gods don't shiver, so he holds himself rigid while servants dry him with linen cloths. The dressing ritual takes an hour. You watch as each garment gets blessed before touching his skin. First the linen undergarment, so fine it's nearly transparent, woven by specially trained servants who maintained ritual purity during its creation. Then the pleated kilt, its folds precisely arranged to hang correctly when he sits or stands. The broad collar, called a vesek, comes next, heavy with gold, turquoise, carnelian and lapis lazuli, its weight distributed across his shoulders. Already he feels the burden accumulating. Then the bracelets, the armlets, the rings, each piece blessed and positioned exactly. Getting dressed is less preparation than armor assembly, each element shielding his humanity beneath layers of divinity. The crown selection depends on today's activities. For the morning temple ritual, he'll wear the white crown of Upper Egypt. This afternoon's audience requires the double crown. Tonight's banquet calls for the blue Kepresh crown associated with military might, even though he's not going to war. It simply looks impressive. You watch servants lift the chosen crown and settle it onto his bewigged head. The weight presses down, forcing him to hold his neck rigid. He'll wear this for the next 6 hours, unable to remove it without divine authority draining away. The false beard gets attached last, that strange plaited symbol of divine kingship. It's not real hair, but a carefully crafted ceremonial piece that hooks behind his ears. It itches constantly and he cannot scratch. This tiny discomfort will persist all day, a permanent low-level irritation beneath the grand performance. Gods don't scratch their faces, so neither can he. Breakfast happens while courtiers read reports and priests review the day's religious obligations. He eats mechanically, bread, figs, a piece of roasted duck, while barely tasting anything. His mind already races ahead to potential problems. The Libyan border needs reinforcement. The high priest of Ptah at Memphis is making political moves. His oldest son showed disrespect yesterday and requires correction. He nods at appropriate moments in the briefings, but everyone can see the divine mask already settling over his features, hardening him into the role. The morning temple ritual cannot be delegated. As high priest, he must personally attend the cult statue of Amun-Ra at dawn. You follow him through Karnak's massive pylons, past courtyards where lesser priests and priestesses conduct their own rituals. The inner sanctum awaits, that holy of holies sealed overnight. Only he can break the clay seal and enter where the god lives. Inside, darkness and incense create a womb-like atmosphere. The cult statue stands in its shrine, barely visible in the dimness. What happens next would seem bizarre if you didn't understand Egyptian religious logic. The pharaoh approaches the statue as both supplicant and equal. He's simultaneously worshipping the god and embodying the god. He performs the opening of the mouth ceremony using ritual tools to awaken the statue. He presents offerings: bread, beer, meat, vegetables, flowers. He burns incense. He recites precise hymns in the ancient liturgical language that even he barely understands. The words have been the same for centuries, their meanings half forgotten but their power supposedly maintained through exact repetition. One mispronounced syllable might offend the deity and unravel cosmic order. No pressure. The ritual takes 90 minutes. His knees ache from kneeling on the stone floor. Smoke from the incense makes his eyes water. The heavy crown threatens to give him a migraine. But he continues with perfect precision because this morning ritual ensures the sun rises, the Nile flows, and Egypt persists for another day. At least that's what everyone believes. He's fairly certain the sun would rise anyway, but he can't risk testing that theory. Returning to the palace, he holds court in the great audience hall. You watch petitioners approach the throne, prostrating themselves before addressing him. They must not make eye contact. Looking directly at the pharaoh supposedly blinds ordinary humans, like staring at the sun. He sits motionless on his throne, the crook and flail crossed on his chest, while his vizier reads petitions aloud. Hours pass in a blur of complaints, requests, and judgments. A land dispute between two nobles, a request for exemption from corvée labour, a foreign ambassador presenting gifts and seeking trade agreements. Here's something that rarely makes it into historical accounts. The pharaoh frequently needs to urinate during these marathon sessions, but he cannot simply stand up and leave. That would shatter the divine illusion. So he holds it, sometimes for hours, his discomfort invisible beneath the expressionless mask. Being a god means transcending bodily needs, even when your bladder insists otherwise. Occasionally a particularly long audience requires him to signal discreetly for a brief recess, but even this is carefully choreographed to avoid seeming too human. Lunch happens in semi-privacy with his closest advisors, the vizier, the high priest, the commander of the army, perhaps the queen. This is when real governance happens. The morning's public audiences were performance. Now comes actual decision-making. You listen as they debate military strategy, economic policy, diplomatic relations. The pharaoh contributes ideas but also defers to expertise. He's not stupid. He knows his vizier understands taxation better than he does, that his general knows warfare, that his treasurer knows trade. The divine autocrat is actually a committee chairman, guiding consensus rather than dictating everything himself. The afternoon might bring inspections, a new granary, a canal project, a ship launched for trade expeditions. He must appear interested, must ask intelligent questions, must seem omniscient about every detail. Priests accompany him everywhere, ready to perform impromptu blessings on buildings, boats, or babies thrust forward by hopeful mothers. He touches a child's head, and the crowd gasps. The divine touch, they believe, brings luck and health. He's fairly certain he's just touched a sticky toddler who might give him whatever illness is currently spreading through Thebes. But he smiles beneficently. Evening brings either diplomatic banquets or religious festivals, depending on the calendar. Tonight it's a banquet honouring a visiting delegation from Byblos. You watch as he reclines on a couch while musicians play, dancers perform, and course after course appears. He must eat delicately, drink moderately, and remain dignified while everyone else gets progressively drunk. He cannot relax, cannot joke too freely, cannot be anything but pharaoh even at his own party. The foreign ambassadors watch him constantly, interpreting every gesture. One wrong word could insult their king and collapse a trade agreement. Finally, near midnight, the day's performance ends. Servants help remove the crown, the collar, the false beard. His head throbs, his shoulders ache. His jaw hurts from maintaining that composed expression for 16 hours. Tomorrow will be identical. The same dawn purification, the same rituals, the same audiences, the same performance of divinity that never ever stops. You watch exhaustion settle over him as servants massage his temples, and you realize this is the secret. Being pharaoh isn't about power or luxury. It's about the relentless, grinding burden of maintaining a role every waking moment, of being always on stage, always perfect, always divine, until the weight of that crown crushes every trace of the human being underneath. You discover a cache of letters hidden in a dusty corner of the royal archives, and they tell stories that never made it onto temple walls. These aren't official pronouncements or diplomatic correspondence. These are personal notes, love poems, desperate pleas, and confessions that reveal the messy emotional lives pharaohs tried desperately to conceal. The divine mask cracks here in the privacy of written words, exposing desires and attachments that contradicted everything Egypt believed about its god-kings. Akhenaten's devotion to Nefertiti appears throughout Amarna's art in ways that scandalize traditional sensibilities. You see them depicted together constantly, touching affectionately, sharing intimate moments with their daughters. One relief shows them kissing, not the formal ritual kind, but something tender and genuine. Inscriptions call her the Sweet One, Mistress of his happiness, and Lady of Grace. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine love or sophisticated propaganda, designed to emphasize the royal couple's fertility and the new religion's emphasis on family. But the sheer volume of affectionate imagery suggests something deeper than political calculation. He seems genuinely besotted with her. Then there's the mysterious successor situation. When Nefertiti disappears from records, a figure named Neferneferuaten appears, possibly Nefertiti herself ruling under a new name, possibly their daughter Meritaten, and then comes Smenkhire, a shadowy co-regent whose relationship with Akhenaten remains debated. Some historians interpret evidence as suggesting a romantic or sexual relationship between the two men. The term beloved appears in inscriptions in ways that might be ceremonial or might be something more intimate. Ancient Egyptian language leaves this frustratingly ambiguous. Were they lovers, brothers, political partners, all three? The secret stayed buried with them. Rameses II's passion for Nefertari seems clearer. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens remains one of Egypt's most beautifully decorated, covered in scenes showing her journey to the afterlife with texts emphasizing her beauty and virtue. He built her a temple at Abu Simbel, an honor almost unprecedented for a queen. Love poetry attributed to their relationship survives, the one for whom the sun shines, and similar romantic phrases. When she died, he appears genuinely devastated, his later wives never receiving the same attention or honor. You can almost feel his grief in the extravagant tomb preparation, as if covering her burial chamber in gold and perfect paintings could somehow ease the loss. But not all royal romances ended in devotion. You uncover evidence of Amenhotep II's affair with a foreign princess sent as a diplomatic gift. She was supposed to enter the harem quietly, produce children if fortunate, and fade into obscurity. Instead, she apparently captivated him so completely that the great royal wife, his Egyptian queen, felt threatened enough to orchestrate the foreign woman's death. Poison in wine made her look like illness. The princess died. The queen maintained her position. The pharaoh mourned privately and said nothing publicly, because acknowledging the affair would diminish his divine status. Here's a quirky detail about royal sexuality. Despite all the emphasis on fertility and producing heirs, actual evidence suggests some pharaohs had surprisingly limited interest in sex. Medical examination of certain mummies reveals underdeveloped sexual characteristics, possible hormonal disorders, or other conditions that might have affected desire or function. The performance of virile god-king clashed with biological reality. You wonder how they managed this discrepancy. Did they fake it? Did their wives discreetly take other lovers to produce the necessary heirs? Some historians suggest exactly that. Royal children attributed to pharaohs might have been fathered by surrogates, while everyone maintained the official fiction. The harem housed not just wives but also royal favourites who might be male companions, trusted servants, or childhood friends. Evidence from certain periods suggests pharaohs maintained intimate friendships that possibly crossed into romance. The distinction between deep friendship and romantic love gets blurry in ancient Egyptian context, where emotional intimacy between men was socially acceptable in ways that later cultures found threatening. Was Tutankhamun genuinely in love with his wife Ankhesenamun, his half-sister? Or was his closest bond with his vizier Ai, who became pharaoh after Tut's death? The mummy evidence shows Tut died young, possibly in Ai's presence, the succession suspiciously smooth. You discover letters between Egyptian princesses sent as diplomatic brides and their families back home. They're heartbreaking. One princess writes to her father, a foreign king, begging him to rescue her from the Egyptian harem where she's been forgotten. The pharaoh never visits her. She has no status, no children, no purpose. She's completely alone in a foreign land, trapped in a gilded cage. Her father apparently did nothing, or couldn't do anything without causing a diplomatic incident. She disappears from records, probably dying lonely and miserable, her romantic hopes crushed by political reality. Some royal love affairs sparked political catastrophe. Cleopatra VII, centuries later, represents the ultimate example of royal romance shaping history. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just personal. They were strategic alliances that nearly reshaped the Mediterranean world. But the ancient Egyptian pharaohs had their own political romantic entanglements. Marriages to Hittite, Mitanni, and Babylonian princesses were supposed to be purely diplomatic, but occasionally genuine affection developed, complicating alliance networks when the pharaoh favoured a foreign wife over Egyptian nobles' daughters. The taboo relationships, those sibling marriages, hide their own complicated dynamics. When Ramesses II married his daughters, Bintanath and Meritamen, were these consummated unions or symbolic arrangements? Historians still argue. Some evidence suggests the marriages were real in every sense, producing children who were simultaneously grandchildren. The genetic consequences show up in later royal mummies as disorders and deformities. Other scholars argue these were ceremonial marriages only, performed to maintain religious symbolism without actual sexual relations. The truth probably varied case by case, pharaoh by pharaoh, making everyone equally right and wrong. You find evidence of jealousy and passion beneath the formal arrangements. One inscription describes a pharaoh's fury when a wife apparently flirted with a foreign ambassador. She disappeared from record shortly after, divorced, executed, or simply removed from official history. Another text hints at a queen's rage when her husband took a new young wife. She couldn't prevent the marriage, but she could make the girl's life miserable through subtle palace politics. These petty human emotions existed alongside the grand divine performance, reminding you that underneath the crowns and ceremony, these were people experiencing the same jealousies, insecurities, and desires as anyone else. The most poignant evidence comes from the tomb goods. You examine jewellery buried with certain queens, lockets containing hair, rings engraved with private messages, small statues depicting couples in tender embraces. These weren't for public display. These were personal treasures meant for the afterlife, suggesting that despite political marriages and diplomatic necessities, genuine affection sometimes developed between royal partners. They hoped to maintain those connections in eternity, believing love might survive even death. And yet the system demanded these relationships remain secondary to dynastic duty. Love couldn't interfere with succession. Romance couldn't complicate alliances. Passion had to be contained, controlled, shaped to serve the state's needs. You watch a young pharaoh torn between duty and desire, between the wife his advisors chose and the woman who actually makes his heart race. He chooses duty, as pharaohs always must, and spends the rest of his life wondering what might have been. The secret is that beneath the divine performance, pharaohs experienced the same romantic yearning, heartbreak and longing as any human. They just had to hide it better, love more carefully, and accept that even their hearts belong to Egypt rather than themselves. You stand in the workshop where artisans craft the pharaoh's public image, and you realize everything you've seen on temple walls is carefully orchestrated fiction. The scribes, sculptors, and painters work from strict guidelines that have nothing to do with reality and everything to do with propaganda. That handsome, perfectly proportioned pharaoh in the reliefs? He's actually short, overweight, and balding. That glorious military victory depicted across an entire temple wall? It was actually a stalemate at best, possibly an outright defeat. But truth matters less than the story Egypt needs to believe. The artistic conventions governing royal depictions haven't changed in centuries. Pharaohs must always appear in the prime of life, strong, athletic, eternally youthful. Even if the actual king is 70 years old with arthritis and missing teeth, his image shows a man of perhaps 30, muscles defined, stance powerful. Artists who depict the pharaoh's true age or physical condition risk severe punishment. One sculptor apparently tried rendering Amenhotep III's obesity accurately, and found himself reassigned to painting tomb walls in some minor noble's burial chamber. The message was clear: show the ideal, not the reality. You watch artists working on battle scenes that will cover the temple at Karnak. The pharaoh dominates the composition, shown at least twice the size of everyone else. He single-handedly defeats hordes of enemies while his army watches admiringly from the background. Historical records, the ones not meant for public consumption, tell different stories. The pharaoh stayed safely behind the lines during most fighting. His generals won the battles. Some campaigns ended in retreat, but the temple walls show only triumph, only divine invincibility, only the story that reinforces his god-king status. The Battle of Kadesh provides the ultimate example of royal propaganda transforming defeat into victory. Rameses II fought the Hittites to a bloody stalemate. Both sides claimed victory, both sides suffered terrible losses, and they eventually signed a peace treaty that acknowledged neither side won. But if you visit Rameses's temples, you'd think he personally slaughtered the entire Hittite army, while Egyptian forces cowered uselessly nearby. The inscriptions describe him as a one-man army, arrows bouncing off his divine flesh, enemies fleeing in terror before his mighty chariot. It's complete fabrication, but it's also brilliant propaganda. The story became truth through sheer repetition, across multiple temples, and eventually even the Egyptians who fought at Kadesh probably started remembering it Rameses's way. Historians still argue about how much pharaohs believed their own propaganda. Did Rameses genuinely remember himself as the solo hero, his memory warped by years of hearing the false version? Or did he privately laugh at the exaggeration while publicly maintaining the fiction? You catch glimpses of self-awareness in private documents. One letter from a pharaoh to a trusted advisor includes a wry comment about the story we're telling about a recent campaign, suggesting he knew the difference between propaganda and truth. But publicly, he played his role perfectly, never acknowledging the gap between image and reality. The control extends beyond military victories to every aspect of royal presentation. Pharaohs who die young, get depicted as having ruled successfully for decades. Failed building projects are retroactively described as completed triumphs. Rebellious provinces that never fully submitted appear on maps as loyal territories. The scribes maintain dual records, official versions for public monuments and honest accounts for administrative purposes. The honest versions rarely survive. They're written on papyrus that decays or gets deliberately destroyed. The propaganda carved in stone lasts forever. Name erasure represents the ultimate propaganda tool. When a pharaoh falls from favour, either during his lifetime due to disgrace or after death, when successors want to disown him, teams of workers systematically chisel his name from every monument. Akhenaten suffered this fate after his religious revolution failed. His successors erased his cartouches, destroyed his statues, and abandoned his city. Later king lists skip directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, pretending Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and Ea never existed. It's propaganda through omission, rewriting history by simply deleting inconvenient pharaohs. Hatshepsut faced similar treatment after her death. Her stepson Thutmose III waited until late in his reign, then ordered her images defaced, her obelisks buried, her name chiselled away. Historians still argue about his motivations. Was it personal resentment for her usurping his throne? Political necessity to erase a female pharaoh and strengthen male succession claims? Regardless, the propaganda campaign nearly succeeded. Hatshepsut disappeared from history until archaeologists pieced together evidence of her reign from fragments and overlooked inscriptions. You discover that pharaohs stage-managed even spontaneous moments. Those scenes showing grateful subjects bowing before the king while he generously distributes gifts. Carefully choreographed. The petitioners were selected in advance, their requests pre-approved, their grateful responses rehearsed. Nothing truly spontaneous could threaten the pharaoh's dignity. Even apparent generosity served propaganda purposes. Look how merciful and wise your god-king is, how he cares for his people. The genuine bureaucratic work of governing happened elsewhere, invisibly, while the public saw only theatrical demonstrations of divine benevolence. Religious propaganda intertwined with political messaging. When pharaohs needed to justify unpopular decisions, they claimed divine instruction through dreams or oracles. Convenient how the gods always agreed with whatever the pharaoh wanted to do anyway. You watch priests stage an oracle ceremony, where the cult statue of Amun chooses the pharaoh's preferred candidate for high priest by tilting slightly when carried past him. The tilt is caused by the bearers subtly shifting the carrying poles, but the crowd sees divine will confirming royal preference. Everyone benefits from maintaining the illusion. Here's something that reveals the sophistication of Egyptian propaganda. They understood narrative control required consistency. A bureaucracy of scribes maintained official story versions across the kingdom. When provincial temples created their own inscriptions, they had to match the approved narrative. Inspectors checked for deviations. If a regional governor described an event differently than the official version, he received a polite but firm correction. The story had to be the same everywhere, repeated until it became the only story anyone remembered. Foreign relations required their own propaganda strategies. Diplomatic letters between pharaohs and other kings show one version of reality: mutual respect, careful negotiation, acknowledgement of relative power. But monuments within Egypt depict those same foreign kings as conquered vassals bringing tribute. Both versions serve different audiences. The foreign kings know the truth but don't see the Egyptian monuments. The Egyptian people see the monuments, but don't read the diplomatic correspondence. Each audience gets the message designed for them. You find evidence that some pharaohs grew frustrated with the propaganda machine. One text, possibly meant as a private journal, complains about the burden of maintaining the performance. The writer laments that he cannot simply be himself, cannot admit uncertainty or fear, cannot show the weakness that every human feels. He must always be the story Egypt tells about him, even when that story bears no resemblance to the person living inside his skin. The text breaks off unfinished, perhaps because he realized even private writings risked exposure and punishment. The ultimate irony is that modern historians largely reconstruct ancient Egyptian history from propaganda sources. The temple walls, the official king lists, the commemorative inscriptions, these are our primary sources, and they're all lies. Or not lies exactly, but carefully crafted narratives designed to project power and maintain divine authority. Somewhere beneath the propaganda, real people made real decisions with real consequences. But those actual humans are almost impossible to recover, buried under centuries of idealized images and carefully edited stories. The secret is that nearly everything we think we know about pharaohs comes from the stories they wanted us to believe, the performance they maintained so successfully that even death couldn't end it. The propaganda outlasted the truth, carved in stone while reality crumbled into sand. You creep through the palace corridors after midnight, following whispers that lead to a secluded chamber where conspirators gather. The air feels thick with treason. These men, a secondary wife's brother, a treasury official with gambling debts, a disgruntled general passed over for promotion, and a priest whose temple lost royal funding, are planning murder. Not just any murder, but deicide. They're plotting to kill a god, and they believe they can succeed because they've seen behind the divine mask. They know the pharaoh bleeds. The harem conspiracy under Ramesses III provides the best documented assassination plot in ancient Egyptian history. The Turin judicial papyrus records the trial proceedings in chilling detail. You read the confessions extracted through torture, though the scribes euphemistically call it examination. Tie, a secondary wife in the harem at Thebes, organized the conspiracy because her son Pentuer had been passed over as heir. She recruited palace officials, military officers, and even magicians who crafted wax figures and recited spells intended to weaken the pharaoh's divine protection. The plot was sophisticated, patient, and it nearly succeeded. The conspirators chose their moment carefully. During the Opet festival, when the palace guard was stretched thin and security focused on public celebrations, you watch them move into position. The poisoner who adds something deadly to the pharaoh's evening wine. The guard captain who will accidentally leave a certain door unlocked. The priest who will spread rumors about divine disfavor to undermine loyalty. Every detail planned, every participant understanding that failure means death by impalement or burning alive. They're betting everything on one knife stroke, one cup of poison, one moment when the God King is vulnerable. But someone talks. Perhaps one conspirator's nerve breaks. Perhaps a servant overhears and reports to a loyal official. Perhaps the pharaoh's own intelligence network, which exists precisely to prevent such plots, catches wind of the conspiracy. Soldiers arrest the plotters before they can strike. Ramesses III apparently survived to see them tried, though modern medical examination of his mummy suggests he died from a throat wound shortly after, possibly from an initial attack that failed to kill him immediately, or from an illness made worse by stress. The truth remains debated. The trials were brutal and methodical. You watch as accused conspirators are brought before judges, high officials loyal to the crown. The examination involves beating the soles of feet with rods, dislocating joints, applying heated implements to sensitive areas until the accused confesses everything. Some maintain innocence despite torture and are acquitted. Others break quickly, implicating additional conspirators in desperate attempts to ease their suffering. The transcripts show the banality of treason. These grand conspirators become whimpering, broken people begging for mercy. The punishments match the crime's enormity. Primary conspirators are executed publicly, their deaths designed as deterrent spectacle. Some are impaled on stakes, dying slowly over hours or days. Others are burned alive. A few noble conspirators, those of higher rank, receive the mercy of forced suicide, allowed to drink poison or cut their own throats rather than face public execution. Pentosaer, the prince who would have been Pharaoh, is compelled to kill himself in his cell. His mother T's fate isn't recorded, but given ancient Egyptian justice, she likely died slowly and painfully. But here's something chilling. The judicial papyrus records that some judges and guards assigned to watch the prisoners were themselves executed for fraternizing with the condemned. They apparently held drinking parties with female conspirators, engaging in what the text euphemistically describes as improper conduct. Even in custody, awaiting execution, these conspirators corrupted their jailers. The officials were found guilty of dereliction and executed alongside the original plotters. No one was safe from suspicion once an assassination plot was uncovered. Historians still argue whether these plots were common or rare. The surviving evidence documents only a handful, but that might reflect successful cover-ups rather than actual infrequency. A pharaoh can't appear vulnerable. Admitting that conspiracies exist, that people want him dead, undermines the divine aura, so most plots probably vanished into unmarked graves. The conspirators quietly disappeared, the official record silent. You only know about the harem conspiracy because it was too large to conceal, and because Rameses III apparently wanted the trial records preserved as warning to future plotters. Palace architecture reflects this constant paranoia. You notice how the royal chambers are positioned deep within the complex, accessible only through multiple checkpoints. Guards are rotated frequently so they can't form relationships with potential conspirators. Servants who prepare royal food are closely watched, often required to taste dishes before serving them. The pharaoh's sleeping chamber has multiple hidden exits, escape routes in case of night attack. Even surrounded by luxury, he sleeps in what's essentially a fortified panic room. Food tasters occupy one of the most anxiety-inducing positions in the palace. You watch a young man taste the pharaoh's dinner, waiting the prescribed time to see if he dies or shows symptoms of poisoning. He survives tonight, so the pharaoh eats, but tomorrow might bring different results. Food tasters have short careers. Poisoning, accidents, or the simple stress of knowing every meal might be their last. Yet the position pays well and offers prestige, so ambitious families push their sons into this deadly service. Some assassination attempts came from unexpected directions. A trusted bodyguard who decided the current pharaoh was leading Egypt to ruin. A childhood friend who felt betrayed by a political decision. A son too impatient to wait for natural succession. You find hints of these in fragmentary records, sudden replacements of key personnel, unexplained executions, oblique references to treachery without details. The gaps in the record speak volumes about what's being hidden. Poisoning remained the preferred method because it offered deniability. A pharaoh who dies from obvious violence creates a succession crisis and potential civil war, but one who dies from apparent illness. That's the will of the gods, a natural transition. So conspirators favoured slow-acting poisons, arsenic, toxic herbs, contaminated food that caused organ failure over weeks or months. By the time symptoms appeared, tracing the source became impossible. The pharaoh sickened, declined, and died, and everyone accepted it as fate rather than murder. Magic featured prominently in assassination plots because Egyptians believed supernatural attack could be as deadly as physical violence. Those wax figures the harem conspirators created, they weren't superstitious nonsense, they were genuine weapons in ancient Egyptian thinking. You watch priests create protective amulets for the pharaoh, recite counterspells, perform rituals to strengthen his divine defenses against magical assault. It's psychological warfare as much as spiritual, making everyone paranoid about invisible threats that could strike from anywhere. The paranoia inevitably corrupts the pharaoh's relationships. He cannot fully trust anyone because anyone might be compromised. His closest advisor might be secretly working for a rival. His favourite wife might be plotting his death to advance her son. His most loyal general might be awaiting the perfect moment to strike. You watch suspicion poison the pharaoh's interactions, making him cold and distant even with people who genuinely love him. The isolation that comes with divinity is bad enough. The fear of assassination makes it unbearable. Some pharaohs dealt with conspiracy through preemptive purges. At the first hint of disloyalty, they executed not just the suspect, but his entire family, his friends, his associates. Better to kill 10 innocent people than let one traitor survive. You watch as an official is arrested on thin evidence, tortured until he confesses to crimes he didn't commit, then executed along with his wife, children, and household servants. The brutality serves its purpose, discouraging conspiracy through terror, but it also creates resentment that breeds new conspiracies. The cycle perpetuates itself, and sometimes the assassin succeeds. The pharaoh dies, the conspiracy is exposed afterward, and Egypt faces chaos. You stand in the throne room as officials desperately try to control the succession, prevent civil war, and maintain the fiction of divine order, while the god-king lies dead from very mortal violence. The next pharaoh must simultaneously investigate his predecessor's murder and move quickly to prevent appearing weak. It's a delicate balance that often fails, plunging Egypt into instability that lasts years or even decades. The secret is that despite all the divine mythology, pharaohs were shockingly vulnerable to the same violence that threatened any ruler anywhere. A blade in the dark, poison in wine, betrayal by someone trusted. The crown might be divine, but the head wearing it was just flesh, just as easily pierced as any commoner's, and the palace corridors echoed with whispered plots that never fully stopped. You sit in on a private council meeting where the real decisions get made, and you notice something striking. The pharaoh speaks least. Around him gather the men who actually run Egypt, the vizier who oversees the entire bureaucracy, the treasurer who controls the wealth, the high priest of Amun who commands religious authority, the general who leads the army, and perhaps one or two childhood friends who've somehow maintained access despite the decades. These are the people who transform divine pronouncements into actual policy, and their power is staggering even if it stays carefully hidden. The vizier, called the Chaiti, functions as prime minister, chief judge, and administrative coordinator rolled into one exhausting position. You watch him shuffle through papyrus documents, each one representing some crisis or decision requiring attention. A dispute over water rights in the delta, grain shortages in the south, a collapsed dam near Elephantine. The vizier must know everything, coordinate everything, and somehow make it all appear to flow from pharaonic wisdom. He wakes before the pharaoh and sleeps after him, if he sleeps at all. The job typically kills men within a decade through sheer stress. One vizier, Rekhmir under Thutmose III, left an autobiography describing his responsibilities, and it reads like a nightmare job description. He oversaw tax collection, supervised building projects, managed the law courts, controlled the treasury, appointed regional governors, received foreign ambassadors, and reported daily to the pharaoh. Oh, and he was expected to be completely incorruptible, despite having his hands on Egypt's entire wealth. Some succeeded at this impossible standard, others quietly skimmed from the top, accumulating fortunes while maintaining public rectitude. The successful ones understood that serving the pharaoh meant making him look good while doing the actual work of governance. The treasurer, overseer of the seal, controls access to Egypt's accumulated wealth, stored in fortified treasuries throughout the kingdom. You watch him calculate grain reserves, gold supplies, and trade goods, making decisions about resource allocation that determine whether provinces eat or starve. He's theoretically the pharaoh's servant, but in practice he wields enormous power. A treasurer who doesn't approve funding can quietly sabotage any initiative by claiming insufficient resources. Smart pharaohs keep their treasurers happy and closely watched. Foolish ones wake up to find their treasuries mysteriously depleted and their treasurer fled to Nubia. The high priest of Amun at Karnak represents a constant political challenge. The temple of Amun accumulated so much wealth through donations and land grants that by the new kingdom it rivaled the crown itself in economic power. You watch the delicate dance between pharaoh and high priest, mutual dependence and mutual suspicion. The pharaoh needs religious legitimacy that only Amun's priesthood can provide. The high priest needs royal favor to maintain his position and privileges. Both smile, exchange courtesies, and privately plot to prevent the other from gaining too much power. Historians still argue about how much actual belief versus political calculation motivated religious appointments. Some high priests were genuinely pious men dedicated to their god. Others were political operatives in priestly robes, using religious authority to accumulate personal power. This same duality applied to pharaohs. Were they sincere believers in their own divinity, or cynical actors playing a role? Probably both, in different proportions depending on the individual. The system worked regardless of personal belief because institutions persisted beyond any single person's faith or doubt. Military commanders add another power center to this complicated network. You observe the general reporting on border security, troop readiness, and potential threats. He commands thousands of men whose loyalty is theoretically to the pharaoh, but practically to whoever pays and feeds them. A general with army support can threaten the throne if the pharaoh shows weakness. So pharaohs rotate military commands frequently, split the army into competing units, and ensure that no single commander becomes too popular or powerful. It's exhausting paranoia, but necessary paranoia. The childhood friends represent the most interesting category. Men who knew the pharaoh before he became divine. You watch one of them joke with the king in a way no one else would dare, reminding him of some embarrassing incident from their youth. The pharaoh laughs, briefly human again, before the divine mask settles back into place. These friends serve as reality checks, preventing complete isolation, but they're also dangerous. They remember when the god was just a boy who fell off his chariot and cried. That memory undermines the carefully constructed divine image, so these friendships must be carefully managed, kept private, never acknowledged publicly. Some inner circle members were eunuchs, men castrated as boys to serve in the palace without sexual threat to royal women. You find them occupying positions of surprising influence precisely because they can't establish dynasties or threaten succession. A eunuch has no sons to advance, no family ambitions, theoretically total loyalty to the pharaoh who elevated him. Some became trusted confidants, privy to state secrets, wielding power through proximity to the throne. Others remained servants despite their access, useful but ultimately replaceable. The dynamics shift constantly as members vie for influence. You watch the treasurer undermine the vizier by questioning his budget requests. The high priest forms an alliance with the general against a reform-minded pharaoh. A childhood friend trades on personal access to enrich himself, selling influence to provincial officials. Its palace intrigue running continuously beneath the surface of formal hierarchy. The pharaoh must navigate these currents while appearing to be above them, all-knowing and in complete control even when he's barely keeping pace with the schemes swirling around him. Written correspondence reveals the calculated nature of these relationships. You read letters where an official praises the pharaoh extravagantly while subtly criticizing a rival. Another letter promises loyalty while quietly positioning the writer to benefit from an anticipated policy change. Everyone speaks in formal, respectful language that barely conceals the power struggles beneath. Reading between the lines requires skill that successful pharaohs developed early or risked being manipulated by more sophisticated operators. Occasionally, the inner circle fails the pharaoh catastrophically. You witness a meeting where advisors unanimously recommend a military campaign that leads to disaster, or support an economic policy that triggers famine. Do they genuinely believe their advice is sound? Are they sabotaging the pharaoh deliberately? Or are they simply wrong, limited humans making mistakes with catastrophic consequences? The pharaoh must decide whom to trust with incomplete information and political agendas muddying every recommendation. Some pharaohs tried ruling without this inner circle, making decisions independently based on their own judgment. This typically ended badly. No single person, however divine, can manage a civilization spanning hundreds of miles and millions of people. The pharaoh who ignores his vizier finds administration collapsing into chaos. The one who alienates his high priest faces religious opposition that undermines his legitimacy. The one who dismisses his general might face military coup. The system requires these powerful subordinates, even as their power constrains pharaonic authority. You notice something fascinating about succession. The inner circle often remains while pharaohs change. The same vizier might serve 3 consecutive kings. A high priest might outlast 5 pharaohs. These career bureaucrats provide continuity, ensuring Egypt functions despite leadership transitions. But they also accumulate knowledge and relationships that make them more powerful than any single pharaoh. They know where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. They remember past policies and their consequences. They understand the machinery of state better than any king ever could. The ultimate irony is that the pharaoh, supposedly all-powerful autocrat and living god, is actually constrained at every turn by the very people who enable his rule. He cannot act without his inner circle's cooperation. He cannot govern without their expertise. He cannot maintain power without their loyalty. So he must constantly reward them, flatter them, occasionally purge them when they grow too powerful, and always fear them because any one of them could destroy him if sufficiently motivated. The secret is that pharaonic power is collective fiction, maintained by this small group of men who found it advantageous to believe in the God King's authority. The pharaoh rules because they let him, serving their own interests through his legitimacy. Remove that cooperation, and divinity evaporates like morning mist, leaving just a confused man wondering why no one obeys his commands anymore. You enter the palace school at dawn, where children who will never have childhoods begin their transformation into gods and administrators. The young princes and princesses range from 5 to 15 years old, all bearing the weight of impossible expectations. They sit cross-legged on reed mats while tutors drill them in hieroglyphics, mathematics, theology, and the elaborate performance of royalty. The youngest ones fidget and yawn. The older ones have already learned to hide their exhaustion behind composed masks. They're not just learning subjects, they're learning to become something other than human. The heir apparent receives the most intensive training. You watch a 10-year-old boy, let's call him the Crown Prince, endure a schedule that would exhaust most adults. He wakes at dawn for physical training, running, swimming in palace pools, wrestling with other noble boys, and practicing with weapons scaled to his size. Egyptian kingship demands physical prowess, so he must develop strength and coordination even if he'd rather be playing with toys. The wrestling sometimes gets brutal. A tutor shouts encouragement as the boy's nose bleeds from a particularly hard throw. Gods don't cry, so he swallows his tears and gets back up. After physical training comes academic instruction. Hieroglyphics must be memorized. Hundreds of symbols representing sounds, words, and concepts. The boy practices on pottery shards called ostraca, cheaper than papyrus for student exercises. His tutor strikes his knuckles with a reed when he makes mistakes. A boy's ears are on his back, goes the ancient Egyptian saying, meaning children learn through beatings. You wince watching the casual violence considered normal education. The boy's hands are constantly bruised, his back sometimes striped from more serious infractions. This is how they forge divine rulers, through pain and humiliation disguised as instruction. Mathematics comes next, essential for administering a kingdom. The boy learns to calculate land areas, grain volumes, and tax percentages. Egyptian mathematics uses a decimal system but lacks zero and relies on unit fractions, making calculations bizarrely complicated. He must determine how to divide 7 loaves among 10 men, or calculate the slope angle for pyramid construction. Some princes excel at this abstract thinking. Others struggle, earning more beatings from increasingly frustrated tutors who know the pharaoh's displeasure awaits if the heir proves incompetent. Religious instruction occupies huge portions of the curriculum. You listen as priests teach the creation myths, the roles of various gods, the intricate theology that justifies pharaonic divine status. The boy must memorize hymns, learn ritual procedures, understand the symbolic meaning of every gesture and offering. He's being prepared to serve as high priest of every temple while simultaneously being worshipped as divine. The theological contradictions would confuse trained philosophers, but a 10-year-old is simply told to accept and memorize. Questions earn punishment. Here's something that adds dark complexity to royal childhood. Many princes know they're in competition with their brothers for the throne. Half-brothers born to different mothers all potentially qualify as heirs. Egyptian succession wasn't strictly primogeniture. The pharaoh could theoretically choose any son. So these boys study together, play together, and quietly understand that only one will inherit everything while the rest risk elimination. You watch them interact with a mixture of childish camaraderie and nascent political calculation. The oldest prince helps his younger half-brother with a difficult text. But is it brotherly affection or strategic alliance building? Princesses receive different but equally rigorous training. They learn music, the harp, the lute, the sistrum rattle used in religious ceremonies. They practice singing the complex liturgical songs required for festivals. They study household management, understanding they'll oversee large staffs as queens or noble wives. Some receive literacy training, though not as extensively as their brothers. A few exceptional princesses, Hatshepsut comes to mind, apparently received educations comparable to princes, preparing them for political roles their culture didn't officially acknowledge women could hold. Foreign languages appear in the curriculum for children destined for diplomatic roles. You hear a young prince practicing Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East. He's learning to read cuneiform tablets, understand Hittite protocol, and negotiate trade terms. It's boring, tedious work, made more frustrating because he'll never use most of this knowledge if he doesn't inherit the throne. But the education continues regardless, because preparation cannot predict which son will eventually rule. Military training intensifies as boys enter adolescence. Historians still argue about how much direct combat training princes received versus ceremonial weapon handling. You watch teenage princes practice with bow and arrow, learning to shoot from moving chariots, the signature Egyptian military technique. Some show genuine talent and seem to enjoy the training. Others merely endure it, knowing they must appear martially competent even if they'd rather be studying poetry. The expectation is universal. Every prince must be able to lead troops, or at least convincingly appear capable of it. The royal children live in a peculiar bubble, simultaneously privileged and imprisoned. They wear fine linen, eat rich food, and never worry about poverty or hunger. But they also cannot leave the palace freely, cannot choose their friends from outside noble families, cannot pursue interests that don't serve dynastic purposes. You watch a young prince stare longingly toward the city beyond the palace walls, where common children play freely in the streets. He's surrounded by luxury, but denied the simple freedom to be just a child. Tutors themselves occupy complicated positions. Many are scribes elevated to teach royalty, wielding authority over royal children while remaining servants themselves. They must be strict enough to ensure learning, but not so harsh. They traumatize future pharaohs who might remember their childhood suffering and seek revenge. You watch one tutor navigate this impossible balance, pushing a prince to excel while softening criticism with encouragement. Another tutor, older and more cynical, simply beats his students mercilessly, figuring fear is simpler than psychology. Some royal children break under the pressure. You hear whispers about a prince who developed strange behaviors, rocking constantly, refusing to speak, pulling out his own hair. The condition might be what modern psychology would recognize as anxiety disorder or autism spectrum, but ancient Egyptians had no such frameworks. The troubled prince was quietly removed from succession consideration and hidden away in a provincial palace, his existence becoming an embarrassing secret. The system had no room for neurodivergence or mental illness in its god-kings. Others adapted by becoming precisely what the system demanded. You watch a 12-year-old princess performing a religious ritual with eerie perfection, her movements precise, her expression serene, her voice steady through complex hymns. She's mastered the performance so completely that you can't tell what she actually feels or thinks. The training has either created a perfect royal or destroyed her authentic self, possibly both simultaneously. She'll make an excellent queen, cold and controlled and utterly reliable, but you wonder what happened to the child she might have been. The loneliest royal children are those born to minor wives with no realistic succession prospects. They receive education but understand they're essentially ornamental, royal blood without royal future. Some become priests or administrators, finding purpose in service. Others drift through life in comfortable irrelevance, neither common enough to escape expectations nor important enough to matter. You meet one such prince, 16 years old, educated beyond most Egyptians, but with nothing meaningful to do. He practices calligraphy because he's good at it, and it fills the empty hours. Physical appearance matters enormously for royal children. Beautiful children receive more attention, better marriage prospects, sometimes even succession preference. Ugly or deformed children face barely concealed disappointment from parents and tutors. You watch servants whisper about a prince with a deformed foot, speculating whether this disqualifies him from the throne. In a culture where physical perfection symbolizes divine favor, disability becomes not just medical challenge but theological problem. And through it all, these children must maintain the fiction that they're different from everyone else, chosen by gods, destined for greatness, inherently superior. But late at night, in the dormitories where royal children sleep, you hear them cry for their mothers, comfort each other after nightmares, and whisper dreams that have nothing to do with crowns or temples. They're just children trying to survive an education designed to transform them into something barely human. The secret is that becoming pharaoh begins in childhood with systematic destruction of everything childlike. Curiosity becomes obedience, playfulness becomes protocol, authenticity becomes performance. By the time these children inherit the throne, they've forgotten how to be anything except what Egypt needs them to be, which is simultaneously everything and nothing. Divine symbols walking around in damaged human bodies, carrying forward a system that consumed their childhoods and will eventually consume their lives. You stand in a torchlit chamber where the pharaoh examines plans for his tomb, and you realize he's been preparing for death since the day of his coronation. The obsession with immortality permeates every aspect of Egyptian kingship, transforming death from an ending into the ultimate test of divine authority. Will his name endure? Will his body survive? Will he successfully navigate the underworld and join the gods in eternal life? These questions haunt him more than any living enemy, because earthly power means nothing if eternity is lost. The tomb construction begins immediately upon coronation, sometimes even before. You watch workers quarrying limestone in the Valley of the Kings, carving into the mountain a labyrinth designed to protect the royal body for millions of years. The pharaoh visits periodically, inspecting progress, suggesting modifications. The tomb isn't just a burial chamber, it's a machine for generating immortality, every wall inscription and protective spell serving specific functions in the afterlife journey. He obsesses over details, the angle of corridors, the quality of paint pigments, the accuracy of hieroglyphic texts. One error might doom his eternal soul. The Pyramid era represents the most extreme expression of this obsession. You stand beside Khufu as he contemplates the Great Pyramid, his monument, his tomb, his bid for eternal remembrance. The construction requires 20 years, tens of thousands of workers, and resources that strain Egypt's economy. Some historians estimate that building the Great Pyramid consumed roughly 10% of Egypt's total GDP annually during construction. That's an insane allocation of national wealth for one man's burial place, but Khufu sees it differently. The pyramid ensures his name survives when everything else crumbles, and he's right. You're thinking about him 4,000 years later. Later pharaohs abandoned pyramids for hidden rock-cut tombs, learning that massive monuments attract tomb robbers. The Valley of the Kings represents a shift in strategy. Hide the burial, make it hard to find, protect it through secrecy rather than obvious grandeur. But the obsession remains identical. You watch Rameses VI examine his tomb's decoration, ensuring every protective deity is properly depicted, every spell correctly inscribed. He's micromanaging his own afterlife, trying to control eternity through meticulous preparation. The Book of the Dead appears in tombs as instruction manual for the afterlife. You read over the pharaoh's shoulder as scribes copy spells onto papyrus. Spell 125, the judgment scene, receives particular attention. The deceased's heart is weighed against Ma'at's feather of truth. If the heart is heavy with sin, the demon Amit devours it, ending existence forever. The pharaoh must memorize the negative confession: I have not killed, I have not stolen, I had not told lies. The list continues for 42 declarations, and he must recite them perfectly before Osiris and the divine judges. Here's where the system gets philosophically interesting. Pharaohs are supposedly divine and infallible, yet they must still pass the afterlife judgment like anyone else. The theological contradiction never quite resolves. Some texts suggest pharaohs skip judgment entirely, automatically joining the gods. Others show them undergoing the weighing ceremony. Historians still argue whether ordinary Egyptians noticed this inconsistency, or if the contradiction simply didn't bother them. Maybe divinity and judgment coexist in ways we don't understand, or maybe no one wanted to point out the obvious logical problem. Mummification represents the ultimate preservation attempt. You enter the embalming workshop, called the Pernefa or House of Beauty, where priests transform the royal corpse into an eternal vessel. The process takes 70 days of careful work. First, embalmers remove internal organs through a small incision, storing them separately in canopic jars. The brain gets extracted through the nose using a hooked instrument, an undignified procedure for someone who spent life being worshipped. The body cavity is packed with natron salt to desiccate it, preventing decay. The embalmers work with religious purpose, each step accompanied by spells and rituals. But you also notice the practical concerns. They're essentially creating a commodity, a preserved body that must last millennia. Quality control matters. Cheaper mummification processes exist for common people, but royal mummies receive premium treatment. The finest resins, imported oils, perfectly woven linen wrappings. Still, sometimes they make mistakes. Modern analysis reveals that some royal mummies were poorly preserved, organs incompletely removed, or bodies damaged during the process. Even the best embalmers couldn't achieve perfection every time. Funerary goods pile up in preparation for burial. You see servants inventorying items destined for the tomb. Furniture, clothing, jewellery, food, wine, games, even toilets. The pharaoh will need everything in the afterlife that he had in life, or so the belief goes. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered nearly intact, contained over 5,000 objects crammed into a relatively small space. Major pharaohs with larger tombs would have received proportionally more. The wealth invested in death dwarfed what most Egyptians saw in entire lifetimes. Magic objects receive particular attention. You watch craftsmen creating Ushabti figures, small servant statues that will magically come to life in the afterlife to perform labour on the pharaoh's behalf. High-status burials might include hundreds of Ushabti, one for each day of the year, plus overseer figures to manage them. It's literally bringing servants to the grave, ensuring the pharaoh never has to do manual labour even in eternity. The class system persists beyond death. Name preservation obsesses pharaohs nearly as much as body preservation. You watch a king inspect cartouches carved on his temple walls, ensuring his name is rendered correctly and prominently. The name carries magical significance. If it's remembered and spoken, the person continues to exist. Conversely, erasing someone's name destroys them in the afterlife. This explains the vicious name erasure campaigns against disgraced pharaohs. It's not just historical revisionism, it's attempted soul murder. Some pharaohs tried cheating death through magical means beyond standard practice. You discover evidence of experimental preservation techniques, additional spells purchased from priests claiming special knowledge, and even attempts to create multiple burial places to confuse death itself. Akhenaten's religious revolution might have partly stemmed from trying to secure better afterlife guarantees through theological innovation. If traditional religion couldn't absolutely ensure immortality, maybe a new religion could. The cult of the dead king establishes temples where priests make daily offerings to the deceased pharaoh's Ka, his spiritual essence. Mortuary temples employ hundreds of people performing rituals that theoretically sustain the dead king forever. You watch priests present food and drink to a statue representing the deceased pharaoh, reciting prayers requesting blessings. The endowments funding these temples represent generational wealth, lands and resources dedicated to maintaining one dead person's cult in perpetuity. But here's the tragic reality. The endowments rarely lasted. Future pharaohs raided mortuary funds for current expenses. Temples fell into disrepair. Priest positions became sinecures for incompetence. Within a few generations, most dead pharaohs were forgotten except for the truly great ones. You see the abandoned mortuary temple of some minor New Kingdom pharaoh. Its roof collapsed, its walls crumbling, no priests in sight. He invested everything in immortality, and got maybe a century of remembrance before oblivion claimed him anyway. Tomb robbery represents the ultimate failure of the immortality project. Despite all the precautions, hidden entrances, false passages, curses inscribed on walls, thieves found almost every tomb. You watch robbers work in the darkness, smashing through sealed doorways, ripping apart mummies searching for amulets and gold, scattering the carefully arranged grave goods. They're not just stealing treasure, they're murdering the dead, destroying the immortality those pharaohs sacrificed so much to secure. The robbers don't care. Dead kings have no power, and gold spends the same regardless of whose tomb it came from. The priests who discovered tomb robberies faced horrible dilemmas. Do they report it and face accusations of negligence? Do they cover it up and risk worse punishment if discovered? Some rewrapped violated mummies and moved them to hiding places, creating caches that archaeologists later discovered. The royal mummies found at Deir el-Bahari were stored like forgotten furniture in a cliffside tomb, great pharaohs jumbled together in hasty reburial. So much for individual eternal glory. And yet, paradoxically, the pharaohs achieved their immortality goal through completely unexpected means. You stand in a museum staring at Tutankhamun's golden mask, surrounded by crowds of tourists photographing it. Millions visit each year. His name is known worldwide. He's more famous now than during his brief lifetime. The immortality came not through magic or mummification, but through archaeology and museums transforming dead kings into cultural icons. They wanted to live forever as gods. Instead, they live forever as artifacts, which is both more and less than they imagined. The secret is that all the elaborate preparation, the massive tombs, the preservation techniques, and the magical spells couldn't guarantee immortality. Most pharaohs are completely forgotten, their names erased or lost, their bodies destroyed or misidentified. The few we remember survived through accident and luck more than preparation. The obsession with controlling death, with ensuring eternal existence through meticulous planning, ultimately failed for nearly everyone. death won, as it always does, leaving behind only broken mummies and empty tombs as testimony to the magnificent, futile human effort to defeat mortality through sheer determination and wealth. You stand on the desert frontier watching the pharaoh prepare for war, and the contrast between divine propaganda and military reality becomes starkly visible. The army assembles, divisions named after gods, thousands of soldiers arranged in impressive formations, chariots gleaming in the sun. The pharaoh rides at the front in his golden chariot, wearing the blue war crown, looking every inch the warrior god about to smite Egypt's enemies. But you notice the extensive bodyguard surrounding him, the way experienced generals actually give the orders, and the pharaoh's white-knuckled grip on the chariot rail. He's terrified, and he should be. War is about to become very, very real. Egyptian military campaigns typically targeted Nubia to the south, Libya to the west, and the Levant to the northeast. You march with the army toward Canaan, watching logistics that would challenge any ancient civilization. The soldiers carry rations for the journey, but rely on supply lines and local foraging. Donkeys and oxen haul tents, weapons, water, and the portable shrine containing the god Amun's standard, providing divine sanction for the campaign. The pace is grueling, 15 to 20 miles daily across desert terrain, and men begin dropping from heat exhaustion before the fighting even begins. The composition of the army reveals Egypt's military sophistication and its limitations. Core infantry units consist of Egyptian conscripts serving their obligatory term, supplemented by professional soldiers who make soldiering a career. Nubian archers provide ranged support. Their skill with bows is legendary, and pharaohs eagerly recruit them. Libyan and Shurdan mercenaries fight for pay, their loyalty lasting exactly as long as their wages. You watch these diverse groups eyeing each other suspiciously, unified only by the pharaoh's authority and the promise of plunder. Chariot warfare represents Egypt's technological advantage. You observe chariot divisions drilling, each vehicle carrying a driver and an archer, the light construction allowing speed and maneuverability. Egyptian chariots are marvels of engineering, wood and leather construction, wheels with 6 spokes for strength and lightness, designed for the flat terrain of Egypt and the Levant. But they're useless in mountains or marshes, limiting where Egypt can effectively fight. The pharaoh rides a specially decorated royal chariot, marking him as both target and inspiration. The Battle of Megiddo under Thutmose III provides insight into how pharaohs actually fought. Historical records, the annals of Thutmose III carved at Karnak, describe the campaign in detail, though filtered through propaganda. Thutmose faced a coalition of Canaanite city-states led by the king of Kadesh. His generals advised the safe, predictable route. Thutmose chose a dangerous mountain pass, gambling that surprise would compensate for risk. You watch the army file through the narrow passage, vulnerable to ambush, gambling everything on their pharaoh's tactical judgment. The gamble pays off. They emerge onto the plain of Megiddo before the enemy expects them, catching the coalition forces unprepared. The battle itself is brief and brutal. Chariot charges, arrow volleys, hand-to-hand fighting with bronze swords and axes. You see the pharaoh participating from relatively safe distance, shooting arrows from his chariot while bodyguards ensure no one gets close enough to threaten him. He's brave enough to be present, but not suicidally reckless. The propaganda will later claim he single-handedly routed the enemy. The reality is more mundane. Competent generals executing a good plan while the pharaoh provides morale boost through his presence. The siege that follows lasts 7 months. Megiddo's walls prove formidable, and Egyptian siege technology is limited. You watch soldiers build earthen ramps attempting to scale walls, while defenders rain arrows and stones down. It's grinding, unglamorous work, digging, hauling dirt, slowly starving out the defenders. The pharaoh remains in his tent much of this time, conducting administration, receiving reports, maintaining the appearance of command without spending months personally supervising dirt hauling. Historians still argue about pharaonic battlefield participation. Some clearly fought personally. Archaeological evidence of battle wounds on royal mummies confirms this. Seqenenre-Tao's mummy shows horrific head trauma from axes and clubs, suggesting he died in close combat against the Hyksos. But other pharaohs delegated actual fighting to generals while claiming personal glory. The line between courageous leadership and self-preservation varied by individual personality and circumstance. The aftermath of victory brings the ugly reality of ancient warfare. You watch soldiers loot the defeated city, taking gold, food, captives. The pharaoh receives tribute from the survivors: precious metals, exotic goods, horses, and children of defeated kings who will be raised in Egypt as hostages, ensuring good behavior. Scribes count severed hands from enemy dead to calculate casualties, a grim accounting method that provides body counts for the official records. The numbers are probably inflated, but some killing definitely occurred. Captives become a significant economic resource. You see columns of prisoners marching back to Egypt in chains, destined for temple estates, quarries, or construction projects. Some will become slaves, others will be settled as farmers in depopulated areas. The distinction between war captive and slave blurs in Egyptian practice. These people provide free labor that enriches the state and the pharaoh personally. Military campaigns are partly about security, but equally about acquiring human resources. Not all campaigns ended in victory. You witness a different scenario, an Egyptian army facing defeat. Perhaps they underestimated enemy strength, or supplies ran out, or the opposing general proved more skillful. The orderly formations dissolve into panicked retreat. Soldiers abandon equipment, fleeing for their lives. The pharaoh's bodyguards hustle him away from the battlefield before he can be captured or killed. Captured pharaohs are unthinkable. It would shatter the divine image. So they must escape at all costs, even if it means abandoning the army. The Battle of Kadesh under Ramesses III exemplifies propaganda transforming stalemate into victory. Ramesses marched against the Hittite Empire, seeking to reclaim territories in Syria. The Hittite king Mu'tali ambushed the Egyptian army, catching divisions separated and vulnerable. You watch chaos as Hittite chariots, heavier and carrying 3 men instead of 2, smash into Egyptian formations. Ramesses and his bodyguard find themselves surrounded, cut off from the main army, facing annihilation. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. Ramesses' version, inscribed on multiple temples, describes him single-handedly fighting off thousands of enemies while his cowardly army fled. He prays to Amun, receives divine strength, and personally defeats the entire Hittite chariot force. It's pure fantasy. The reality, pieced together from Hittite sources and careful analysis, suggests that additional Egyptian divisions arrived in time to prevent complete disaster. The Hittites pulled back to protect their camp from being looted, and both sides fought to exhaustion before withdrawing. The battle ended inconclusively. Both sides lost heavily. Neither achieved their objectives. They eventually negotiated a peace treaty, the first recorded international peace agreement, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. But Ramesses spent the rest of his life claiming glorious solo victory at Kadesh, and most Egyptians believed him because the propaganda was too magnificent to question. You realize that pharaonic warfare often cared more about the story than the actual outcome. Some pharaohs rarely fought at all. Akhenaten apparently never led military campaigns, too absorbed in his religious revolution to bother with borders. Provincial governors wrote desperate letters, the Amarna letters, begging for military support against invading forces. Akhenaten ignored them, and Egyptian control over the Levant collapsed. His pacifism or negligence undid generations of military conquest, though the temple walls naturally said nothing about these failures. The psychological toll of warfare on pharaohs rarely appears in records, but hints emerge. You notice a king who develops a nervous tic after his first battle. Another becomes obsessed with military preparedness, conducting endless drills, expanding the army beyond what the economy can sustain. Some pharaohs clearly enjoyed warfare. The glory, the excitement, the validation of their martial prowess. Others endured it as necessary obligation, returning from campaigns exhausted and haunted by things they'd witnessed. Naval warfare added another dimension. Egyptian ships, built for river transport, were awkward on the Mediterranean but sufficient for coastal campaigns. You watch Ramesses III's forces fight the Sea Peoples in a naval battle depicted at Medinet Habu. Archers fire from ships, boarding parties fight hand-to-hand on deck, and drowning men thrash in the water. The pharaoh observes from shore, safe from danger but present enough to claim participation. The victory is real this time. The Sea People's invasion is stopped, Egypt survives intact, and Ramesses legitimately deserves credit for organizing the defense. The secret of pharaohs at war is that they were simultaneously essential and irrelevant. Their presence inspired troops, legitimized campaigns, and provided the divine authority that held armies together. But actual military success depended on generals, logistics, training, and luck far more than pharaonic battlefield prowess. The propaganda required depicting pharaohs as warrior gods personally smiting thousands. The reality was messier, more complicated, and far less glorious. Frightened young men in golden chariots trying to appear brave while professional soldiers did the actual fighting. And somehow, despite the gap between image and reality, the system worked well enough to keep Egypt powerful for 3,000 years, which suggests that maybe the performance of warrior kingship mattered more than the reality anyway. You enter the chambers of an aging pharaoh, and the contrast with his youth is startling. The vigorous warrior god depicted on temple walls has become a frail old man who struggles to rise from his bed. His joints ache with arthritis. His breath comes short from decades of accumulated illness. His once sharp mind wanders occasionally, forgetting names or repeating stories. But he cannot simply retire into dignified old age. Gods don't retire. So he continues the performance even as his body fails, each public appearance requiring more effort, more makeup to hide the decay, more attendants to support him when he walks. The succession question dominates everything in these final years. You watch him obsess over which son should inherit, changing his mind repeatedly as princes jockey for position. His oldest son, the one he designated heir decades ago, died from illness 3 years back. The second son shows promise but lacks political cunning. The third son has the right temperament, but was born to a minor wife, creating legitimacy problems. The fourth son is clearly his favourite, but might be too young to hold power against ambitious generals and priests. The decision paralyzes him because choosing wrong could plunge Egypt into civil war. Some pharaohs tried to solve this by appointing co-regents, having the chosen heir rule alongside them during their final years. You watch the ceremony where an elderly pharaoh crowns his son as junior king, both wearing crowns simultaneously, sharing the throne. It's politically brilliant. The succession is established, the heir gains experience, and potential rivals understand the decision is final. But it also creates awkward dynamics. The old king resents his declining relevance. The young king chafes at being subordinate when he's doing most of the actual ruling. They smile for public appearances while privately navigating complicated power-sharing arrangements. The old pharaoh's advisors maneuver for advantage, knowing his death will reshuffle the entire power structure. You watch the vizier cultivate relationships with all potential heirs, ensuring he'll remain valuable regardless of who succeeds. The high priest positions his supporters for key appointments in the next reign. The treasurer quietly moves assets, preparing for possible chaos. Everyone is loyal to the dying king's face while preparing for life after his death. It's mercenary but realistic. Institutions persist beyond individuals, and smart bureaucrats ensure their own survival. Physical decline brings humiliation that divine status cannot prevent. The pharaoh who once controlled his bladder through 6-hour ceremonies now needs servants to help him to the toilet, sometimes not making it in time. The god who radiated strength now requires assistance standing, his legs too weak to support him. He tries maintaining dignity through the indignities, but you see shame in his eyes when servants clean him after he soils himself. The divine mask cracks under the weight of basic biology, revealing the frightened old man underneath. Some pharaohs descended into senility in their final years. You observe one who no longer recognizes his own children, who speaks to people dead for decades, who issues contradictory orders he forgets minutes later. The court maintains the fiction of competent rule, with the vizier and inner circle making actual decisions while attributing them to pharaonic wisdom. It's government by committee disguised as autocracy, and it works because everyone benefits from maintaining the illusion. But occasionally the charade breaks down. The pharaoh appears publicly in confused state, or makes an obviously insane pronouncement that must be quietly ignored. Medical care intensifies as death approaches. You watch physicians try everything: more potent medicines, additional prayers, consultation with magicians claiming special healing powers. Nothing works because they're fighting natural aging and accumulated disease beyond ancient medicine's capacity to treat. The pharaoh knows he's dying. The physicians know it too. But no one can acknowledge this truth because gods don't die of natural causes. They go forth to the horizon, or join Ra in his bark, euphemisms that preserve divine mythology while accepting mortal reality. Historians still argue about whether pharaohs truly believed in the afterlife or simply performed belief as part of their role. You watch this dying king pray to Osiris, and you cannot tell if the devotion is genuine or desperate hope from a terrified man facing oblivion. Maybe belief and performance became so intertwined over a lifetime that he can't distinguish them anymore. He's been playing the role so long that the character and the person merged into one confused identity that's partly human, partly divine, and wholly uncertain what awaits beyond death. The deathbed becomes a political theatre. You watch as princes, queens, advisors, and priests gather around the failing king, ostensibly to receive his wisdom, but actually to position themselves for the succession. The old pharaoh knows this. He's dying, not stupid. But he's too weak to prevent the maneuvering, so he simply watches the performance around him, the exaggerated grief, the professions of loyalty, the barely concealed calculation. It's exhausting and depressing, but it's how power transitions in systems built around individuals rather than institutions. Some pharaohs tried controlling events after death through elaborate instructions: how the funeral should proceed, which son should rule, what offerings the mortuary cult should make. You read a testament dictating precise details. My son shall be Pharaoh. The high priest of Amun shall retain his position. The vizier shall continue in office. My daughter shall receive these estates. He is trying to govern from beyond the grave, maintaining control even after death. Most of these instructions are ignored within months of his burial, but writing them provides psychological comfort in his final hours. The actual death, when it comes, is often anticlimactic. No dramatic final words, no peaceful passing surrounded by loved ones. Just an old man's breathing growing shallower, then stopping. Servants notice first. They alert the vizier, who confirms the death before making any announcement. The body is already cooling when priests arrive to begin the prescribed mourning rituals. Outside, Egypt continues unaware that its god-king has died, the sun rising on a kingdom that will learn later that its divine protector is gone. The official announcement is carefully stage-managed. You watch as heralds proclaim that the pharaoh has gone forth to the horizon, avoiding the word death. Official mourning begins, wailing, tearing of garments, covering of heads with dust. Some grief is genuine, particularly from family members and long-serving attendants. Much is performance, expected behaviour during royal deaths. The whole kingdom enters mourning period, though life continues beneath the ritual grief. Farmers still farm, merchants still trade, and politicians immediately begin manoeuvring around the new pharaoh. The succession moment is dangerous. If the heir is young, ambitious nobles might try seizing power. If multiple sons claim legitimacy, civil war threatens. If there's no clear heir at all, Egypt faces potential collapse. You watch the inner circle move quickly to crown the chosen successor, performing an abbreviated coronation before opposition can organize. Speed matters more than elaborate ceremony. Once crowned, the new pharaoh gains divine legitimacy that's hard to challenge. Delay creates opportunity for chaos. Some successions went smoothly. Designated heir takes power. Continuity maintained, no disruption. Others exploded into crisis. You witness a succession where the old pharaoh died suddenly without clear designation. 3 sons immediately claim the throne, each supported by different factions. The resulting civil war lasted 18 months, devastating the country before one brother finally won. By then, so much damage had been done that his reign began with the treasury empty and the population traumatized. The old pharaoh's failure to establish succession cost Egypt dearly. Female succession created particular complications. Hatshepsut seized power as regent for young Thutmose III, then declared herself pharaoh in her own right. After her death, he ruled for decades before ordering her name erased from monuments. Was he settling scores for her usurping his throne, reasserting male succession norms? We'll never know his true motivations, but the erasure campaign began late in his reign, suggesting complex feelings about his predecessor stepmother aunt that took decades to process. The dead pharaoh's body begins its journey to immortality, 70 days of mummification while the kingdom adjusts to new rule. You watch the embalming priests work with religious devotion and commercial efficiency, transforming the corpse into a divine vessel. The organs removed, the body dried, the wrappings applied with prayers and amulets. It's the same process for every pharaoh regardless of how successful their reign was. Death equalizes what life distinguished. The funeral itself is magnificent. Procession from palace to tomb, priests burning incense, professional mourners wailing, the heir performing the opening of the mouth ceremony to reanimate his father for the afterlife. Everyone who matters attends, demonstrating loyalty to the new regime while ostensibly honouring the old. You watch faces in the crowd, Some show genuine grief, others barely concealed relief, most just performing the expected emotions. The old pharaoh is laid in his tomb, surrounded by goods for eternity, and sealed away. Within a generation, most people will forget him unless he was truly exceptional. The secret of these final years is how they expose the central lie of pharaonic divinity. Gods don't age, don't decline, don't soil themselves in confusion, don't die frightened and diminished. But pharaohs do all these things, maintaining the divine performance even as their bodies betray the mortal truth. The accession struggles reveal that for all the eternal imagery, each reign is temporary, each pharaoh eventually replaced, each divine ruler ultimately just another human who lived, aged, and died. The institution persists. The individuals pass through it like water through fingers. And yet the next pharaoh will repeat the same performance, claiming the same divinity, maintaining the same impossible fiction that somehow sustained Egypt for 3,000 years, despite being obviously, transparently, beautifully false. You stand in the embalming tent, the Per-Nefer, as priests prepare to transform the pharaoh's corpse into an eternal being, and you realize this 70-day process represents humanity's most elaborate denial of death finality. The body lies on a slanted stone table, still wearing the expression it held at death. Soon that face will be unrecognizable, transformed through procedures that are simultaneously surgical, religious, and magical. The head embalmer, wearing the jackal mask of Anubis, approaches with bronze instruments that gleam in the lamplight. The most intimate violation of the God King's body is about to begin. The brain removal happens first, though Egyptians considered the brain largely useless, just packing material for the skull. You watch as an embalmer inserts a long bronze hook up through the nostril, breaking through the ethmoid bone into the cranial cavity. He stirs the hook, liquefying brain tissue, then inverts the body to let the mess drain out through the nose. It's grotesque and undignified, this scrambling of the organ that held every thought and memory the pharaoh ever had. His military strategies, his love for his children, his secret fears, all reduced to grey sludge dripping into a basin. The embalmers work with professional detachment, having done this hundreds of times. The abdominal incision comes next. Using a flint blade, bronze is reserved for ritual implements, flint for cutting flesh. An embalmer slices along the left side of the abdomen. His colleagues reach inside, removing organs with practiced efficiency. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines are extracted, washed in palm wine and treated with natron. Each organ will be preserved separately in its own canopic jar, protected by a different deity. The heart remains in the body. Egyptians believed it was the seat of intelligence and emotion, needed for the afterlife judgment. Modern examination of mummies sometimes finds the heart carefully wrapped and protected, while other organs are carelessly handled or missing entirely. You watch as they pack the body cavity with temporary stuffing, linen bags filled with natron salt, sawdust, and aromatic herbs. The natron slowly desiccates the flesh, drawing out moisture that would otherwise fuel decomposition. The body will remain buried in natron for 40 days, the primary preservation period. Its chemistry disguised as magic, and it works remarkably well. 3,000-year-old mummies prove the effectiveness of this salt-drying technique, even if the embalmers didn't understand the bacterial processes they were preventing. The purification rituals accompany every physical procedure. Priests recite spells from the funerary texts, ensuring magical protection matches physical preservation. They burn incense, frankincense and myrrh imported at enormous cost from Punt. They pour libations of water, wine, and milk. The tent fills with smoke and chanted prayers, creating an atmosphere that's part surgical theatre, part religious ceremony. You realize these embalmers are simultaneously technicians and priests, their work requiring both manual skill and theological knowledge. After 40 days in natron, the body emerges dried and darkened, flesh hardened to leather. The temporary stuffing is removed, and embalmers begin the delicate work of making the mummy look lifelike. They pack the body cavity with linen, sawdust, and more aromatic materials: cinnamon, cassia, juniper berries. Some embalmers insert false eyes made from stone or painted linen to fill the collapsed eye sockets. Others stuff the cheeks from inside the mouth, restoring facial contours. It's cosmetic work on a corpse, trying to preserve the pharaoh's appearance for eternity. The wrapping takes days of meticulous work. You watch as embalmers begin with the fingers and toes, wrapping each individually before covering the hands and feet. They work systematically up the limbs, around the torso, finally covering the head and face. Between layers of linen they insert protective amulets, scarabs over the heart, jed pillars for stability, wadjet eyes for protection. Each amulet is blessed and positioned according to precise ritual requirements. The linen itself is often recycled from temple furnishings or donated by wealthy individuals hoping to share in the pharaoh's afterlife blessings. Historians still argue about whether embalmers truly believed their work ensured immortality or simply performed traditional practices without deep faith. You watch their faces as they work. Some show reverence, others boredom. Embalming is a profession, passed from father to son through generations. After hundreds of mummies, does the work remain sacred or become mere routine? Probably varies by individual, just like any profession mixing the spiritual and practical. The skilled ones take pride in their craft regardless of personal belief, creating the best possible mummy because professional reputation matters. The mummy lies finished, wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, its shape barely human anymore. A painted cartonnage mask covers the face, idealizing the pharaoh's features into divine perfection. Gold leaf might adorn the mask if resources allow. Precious oils are poured over the wrappings as final consecration. The transformation is complete. The corpse has become a Sa, a divine body capable of housing the Ka and Ba spirits in the afterlife. At least that's the theory. In practice, it's a preserved corpse wrapped in expensive linen, but the Egyptian theological framework transforms it into something transcendent. The funeral procession begins at dawn. You join the crowd following the sledge carrying the pharaoh's coffin toward the Valley of the Kings. Professional mourners lead the way, wailing and tearing their clothes with theatrical grief. Musicians play drums and sistrums. Priests burn incense in elaborate censers. The new pharaoh follows, performing the role of grieving son, even if he's actually relieved his father finally died. Queens and royal children trail behind, their grief probably genuine mixed with concern about their own futures under the new regime. The journey to the tomb takes hours. The procession stops at the mortuary temple where priests perform additional rituals. Food offerings are presented to the deceased: bread, beer, meat, vegetables. The priests recite the liturgy, asking gods to welcome the pharaoh into the afterlife. Meanwhile, servants are transferring the tomb goods: furniture, chariots, jewellery, ushabti figures, everything the pharaoh might need in eternity. The tomb that took 20 years to prepare is finally receiving its occupant. At the tomb entrance, the opening of the mouth ceremony represents the ritual climax. The new pharaoh touches ritual implements to his father's mummy, symbolically restoring the deceased's ability to breathe, eat, see, and hear in the afterlife. It's magical thinking made physical. Touching an adze and chisel to a mummy's mouth doesn't actually do anything, but within Egyptian theology, it reanimates the deceased's spiritual capacities. You watch the new king perform the ritual with concentration, perhaps believing it works, perhaps just following tradition, perhaps both simultaneously. The coffin, actually a nested set of coffins, each more elaborate than the last, is carried into the tomb and positioned in the stone sarcophagus. The canopic jars containing organs are placed nearby. Shabti figures are arranged in their hundreds. Food, wine, and oil are stacked along the walls. It's a complete household compressed into underground chambers, everything needed for eternal existence. The priests make final offerings, recite final spells, and begin backing out of the tomb, sweeping away their footprints as they go, symbolically preventing the dead from following them back to the world of the living. The sealing happens quickly once everyone exits. Stonemasons wall up the entrance with limestone blocks, plastering over the joints. The royal seal is stamped into the wet plaster, a jackal over 9 captives, the necropolis seal that warns against violation. More rubble is piled in front, hiding the entrance. The tomb that consumed decades of preparation is sealed in hours, its location hopefully lost to future grave robbers. In practice, the secrecy rarely lasted more than a generation or two. Most royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, sometimes within years of burial. You watch the crowd disperse, the mourning period officially ended, Egypt returning to normal life. The dead pharaoh is now the responsibility of his mortuary cult, priests who will make daily offerings at his temple, maintaining his cave spirit's sustenance. The endowment for this cult supposedly lasts forever, but forever rarely exceeds a few generations before funds get reallocated, and the dead king is forgotten by everyone except scholars reading ancient lists. The new pharaoh returns to the palace to begin his own reign, knowing this entire process awaits him eventually. The cycle continues: coronation, rule, aging, death, mummification, burial, and slow forgetting. Each pharaoh believes his preparations will ensure eternal remembrance, but history shows that only the greatest or luckiest achieve lasting fame. Most fade into obscurity, their tombs robbed, their mummies destroyed or lost, their names surviving only in fragmentary king lists that historians struggle to interpret. And yet, paradoxically, they succeeded beyond their imagining. You stand in a modern museum looking at a royal mummy, perhaps Ramesses II or Tutankhamun, encased in climate-controlled glass while tourists photograph it. The pharaoh wanted eternal existence and got it, though not in any form he anticipated. Instead of dwelling in his tomb, eating offerings and enjoying his possessions, he's a museum exhibit, his preserved body studied by scientists, his DNA analysed, his diseases diagnosed, his death reconstructed. He's immortal, but as a specimen, not a god. His name is known worldwide, but as a historical curiosity rather than a divine ruler commanding worship. The irony deepens when you consider that many pharaohs we remember best were failures or oddities. Tutankhamun was a minor king whose greatest achievement was dying young with his tomb mostly intact. Akhenaten is famous for his failed religious revolution. Hatshepsut is remembered for being female in a male role. The great conquerors and successful administrators often fade into obscurity while the unusual cases captivate modern imagination. The immortality they achieved rarely matches the immortality they sought. The wind down begins now, as your journey through pharaonic lives reaches its natural conclusion. You've walked beside these god-kings from dawn rituals to deathbed scenes, witnessing the gap between divine performance and human reality. The secret lives of Egypt's pharaohs weren't particularly secret. They were just human, mundane, occasionally noble, often petty, always struggling beneath the weight of impossible expectations. They were people playing roles so demanding that the performance consumed their entire existence, transforming them into living symbols that served Egypt's needs while destroying their individual humanity. They ruled absolutely while being absolutely ruled by the system that elevated them. They were everything and nothing, gods with clay feet, autocrats who were prisoners of protocol, immortals who died like everyone else and hoped desperately that the elaborate rituals might somehow make it not matter. The temples still stand, massive and magnificent, their walls covered in propaganda that transformed flawed humans into divine perfection. The tombs still hide in desert cliffs, most empty now, robbed and violated despite all precautions. The mummies rest in museums far from home, studied and photographed by people who would be incomprehensible to them. And the legacy persists. Our fascination with ancient Egypt, with pharaohs and pyramids, with the civilization that convinced itself that humans could become gods if they performed divinity convincingly enough. They believed in eternal life and got historical memory instead, which is perhaps the closest thing to immortality that actually exists. The pharaohs sleep now, their struggles finished, their performances complete, their secret lives finally revealed as ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. The universal human experience wrapped in gold and linen and 3,000 years of accumulated mythology that couldn't quite hide the beating hearts beneath.